Welcome back to World War Now, everybody. I am your host, Conrad Franz, joined as always by Dmitry Kalyagin here with a huge week of World War III analysis. The Lebanon ceasefire has been not just broken, but destroyed, shattered, never to return. Israel has dramatically struck Beirut proper. It's been condemned by everyone from Emmanuel Macron to, of course, local Lebanese officials. We're going to be discussing, of course, the situation in Gaza where the ceasefire was shattered mere weeks ago as well as, of course, the ongoing situations in Syria, the huge protests in Turkey that continue to grow in number as Erdogan is facing one of the biggest political crises of his career. We're going to discuss the obvious movements of U.S. bombers to Diego Garcia, the potential for impending strikes on Iran's nuclear capabilities between the U.S. and Israel. Obviously, the massive strikes on the Houthis from the U.S. has been increasing. And of course, we're going to discuss the signal leak, which was obviously related to those Houthi strikes as well. J.D. Vance is visiting Greenland, prompting Vladimir Putin to directly address the sort of U.S. encroachment into the Arctic and how the Arctic is likely going to be a future theater of conflict. Obviously, Russia is advancing in Ukraine as well as Ukraine also has entered the Belgorod region. So we're going to be discussing all of that, the ongoing Third World War in Africa, what's going on in Sudan, the potential relocation locations for the Palestinians as that is continuing to be discussed. But it's a huge week. We're going to be breaking down all sorts of things, church news as well. So before we dive into it, Dmitry, how are you doing?
Doing great, Conrad. And of course, commencing in the Middle East and the Levant in particular, there have been, again, bombings from both sides of the conflict, although it's still unclear exactly who shot the missiles that flew over the Israeli-Lebanese border and injured a few people, which again prompted Israel to commence or sort of recommence the strikes against Beirut, which, mind you, for all those who may not be familiar with the cities and capitals of the Middle East, Beirut is literally the capital of Lebanon. It's a huge metropolis, a very diverse city. It's literally divided into quarters. There's Christian quarters, Shia, Sunni, Muslim quarters, etc. It's a very diverse city, but still like a very modern metropolis by all standards. Certainly not a first world city, but second world. And Israel has just struck and destroyed a few apartment buildings. Again, it's absolutely unhinged what they've done in the last few days. And speaking to this, of course, people like Emmanuel Macron, the president of France, as well as some other European leaders, have already condemned this particular action. But if we recall, Lebanon, the new president, has still not really offered any sort of solutions to the Israeli occupation of Lebanese land south of the Litani River in southern Lebanon, just adjacent to the Israeli border. And it's still unclear as to how Lebanon will address this duality in power, because Lebanon at the moment, Conrad, is between a rock and a hard place. It can, again, move to disband Hezbollah and to suppress the Shia resistance to Israel and Israeli dominance of the Palestinians and other Muslims in the Levant. But however, if it does that, it risks starting a civil war within its own country. At the same time, as we've seen in Syria, what happens when a civil war breaks out in the country? The Israelis win. And I think Joseph Aoun, the president of Lebanon, despite his many connections to Europe and probably his questionable background, he still probably understands that his country will be on the brink of absolute destruction similar to Syria. And the only beneficiary of this will not be the Lebanese people, will not be any sort of faction in Lebanon. It will literally be the Israeli Jews who will again begin dominating and most likely will take the entirety of the land south of the Litani River, which again prompt and push forward this plan of Greater Israel, which again, this particular plan sees the Israeli domination, not just of Lebanon, but also further into Syria and almost all the way to the Euphrates and Tigris rivers, Mesopotamia, and places including the Sinai Peninsula and even into Arabia itself. So this plan of Greater Israel, of course, has already commenced this year and last year. We've seen it in the works since October 7th. Israel has expanded tremendously. It's seeing successes in terms of assassinating and taking out the heads of Hezbollah, Hamas, etc. And it doesn't seem like there's any international outcry beyond, of course, the ICJ proceedings in South Africa. And this bombing of Beirut, Conrad, I think it's just another strike for Israel in terms of they're trying to reach their particular goals. Israel has already stated that, look, Hezbollah had a drone building factory, like a facility where they store drone parts, and they were constructing them in this apartment building. So we just took the entire building down with these long-range bombs shot from the Israeli planes. So again, Israeli planes can literally fly over the eastern Mediterranean coast shoreline, perhaps even flying over the Lebanese shore itself, the land, and just shoot missiles into a capital city of a sovereign nation. So just for consideration, this is completely unprecedented. It's as if a Ukrainian F-16 donated fighter plane can fly to Moscow and shoot down, say, a military target. This would be, again, people would warn of a nuclear war. But because Lebanon is so weak, everyone seems to close their eyes. And these somewhat heavy-handed statements from President of France, Emmanuel Macron, they really don't do justice to the situation, how much this shatters and breaks the status quo of international law in the modern world, of course, which has already been shaken since, I would say, the Maidan in Ukraine and, of course, the civil war in Syria and all the neighboring countries such as Qatar and Turkey supporting that civil war breaking out in that particular country, breaching the sovereignty of the Syrian people. And, of course, the NATO no-fly zone, as well as escalation against Libya in 2011. All these events have led to this new reality that we live in where national sovereignty is not respected. And in fact, I think this could lead to dire consequences, which I think we cover on this show, and we describe it literally as the Third World War.
Now, the Third World War is very much here. Before I continue with this regional analysis, I want to make sure everybody checks out the replay of my new show, Episode 1 of World War Live. It's going to be live every Tuesday evening around 7:45 Central Standard Time. Episode 1 went very well. In the future, I may be taking calls and, obviously I'm answering audience questions. So be sure to check that out on the World War Now YouTube channel. I'm going to be, again, live every Tuesday evening. So be sure to get notifications on and check that out. And be sure to check out our recent Ether Hour discussion with Jay Dyer as well about the JFK files, the JFK assassination, and all sorts of sort of adjacent conspiracies and interesting goings on in the worldwide deep state and, everything specifically focusing on Israel as well. So be sure to check that out. It's going to be linked down below. But what you said about Lebanon is obviously very true. Right before this, during, the escalations, because this isn't the first time that Israel has, struck Lebanon since the quote unquote ceasefire came into effect. This is from Jason Ditz. While Israel has launched hundreds of attacks into Lebanese territory since the ceasefire went into effect in November, they had so far only done flights over the capital city of Beirut. Today, however, they started attacking the capital again. Moments before the attack started, IDF spokesman Avichat Adrai issued a statement in Arabic on Twitter informing the area of imminent attack and ordering civilians to withdraw from at least 300 meters around the target, which was displayed in a satellite image along with its name. The area is smack dab in a residential neighborhood in the suburbs south of Beirut, and the target is actually a private school, kindergarten through 12th grade, called the Lycée des Arts, and neighboring buildings. The website for the Lycée is in English and shows what looks like a very ordinary, very nice school. So yeah, this was, obviously they were probably targeting some specific person, but it appears that, again, schools, these things are never off the table for the Zionist entity. Israel's narrative presents recent rocket fire as a Hezbollah attack. Though Hezbollah has denied involvement, 6 rockets were fired, of which 3 crossed the border, all intercepted, so no damage was actually caused. Lebanon's army found the primitive rocket launchers used in the attack and destroyed them in a few hours. This is unlikely to be Hezbollah as well, given that they have more advanced launch systems that they would commonly use. No group has claimed credit. So, this comes after on Wednesday, Nawaf Salam, Prime Minister of Lebanon, said no one wants to normalize with Israel and Lebanon, and it is rejected by all Lebanese. So despite the fact that President Joseph Aoun, the Maronite, he's using this again as an opportunity to somehow condemn Hezbollah, who weren't even responsible for this launch, it's clear that there are other smaller, likely Islamist groups that exist in southern Lebanon that are trying to take up arms themselves and express, some form of solidarity as the Gaza war has escalated, much like the Houthis have. And it says that, a lot of these launches didn't even make it into Israeli airspace. That's what's going on with the Houthis as well. Most of their launches are either failing on the ground or not making it far enough because the U.S. is dramatically reducing their capacity to launch these weapons. We're going to talk about that in a second. But yeah, everyone's still using this as an excuse to dismantle Hezbollah. But it's clear that this entire quote unquote ceasefire up until this point has been a de facto basically allowance by the Lebanese so that Israel can just continue to dismantle Hezbollah. Macron did call for the Israeli army to withdraw from the 5 points that they still occupy in southern Lebanon, but Israel seems dedicated to just ignoring that and not, basically continuing their occupation of southern Lebanon until eventually they either are able to annex that territory or the international community somehow forces both them and Hezbollah just completely out. And, that's the best case scenario at this point, possibly for the Lebanese, unless Iran does something, because it's clear that these Maronites, a lot of these, people that are more aligned with the West and Lebanon, they almost just consider southern Lebanon enemy territory, not Israeli territory, but they consider it the territory of their internal enemies. And until the strikes actually hit Beirut, which is something that a lot of people would hold them, even in their political base, politically responsible for, then they have to get all mad about it, despite the fact that the Israelis have been striking Lebanese territories since the day after this supposed ceasefire went into effect. That was just people in Beirut allowing their political enemies to be dismantled by Israel, which is Very scummy behavior, in my opinion. And Israel, of course, continues to advance into Dara, into the Quneitra province in southern Syria. All the while, Turkey and the SDF continue to fight. But Israel, not just, launching from the Golan Heights, but the like manpower, but they're launching regular air raids, regular flyovers of Damascus, even cities farther north than that. So Israel has almost achieved total air dominance in Syria. And I highly doubt that the Turks would actually shoot down an Israeli plane, despite the fact that, the Israelis are convinced that, or at least convincing the press that they really want the Russians to remain to offset the Turks. And, Turkey is their current biggest threat. And, they're this Qatar, Turkey, Egypt axis potentially that they are afraid of, this new Shia axis, and they're too afraid, I guess, of them supposedly having a bunch of influence in Syria. But again, I think that's a bit of a dog and pony show to make people think that, oh, we can support this Sunni axis with Turkey at its head and still be, pro-Palestine, still be against Israel. We don't need to support the axis of resistance in Iran. But in reality, I think we all know that only one of these groups being in power has allowed Israel to dramatically expand the Greater Israel Project, and that is, of course, the Sunni Shabbos Goyim.
Oh, no, absolutely. But on a much lighter note, there was an interesting story I read this week about a Holocaust survivor in the UK, actually, who was arrested in the UK for protesting and saying, really violent things. He was interviewed by the police. Well, let's just say it wasn't a clear arrest, but he was protesting in favor of Palestine. This was a Jewish Holocaust survivor who lived in Hungary, and he was 7 years old in 1944 when the Third Reich invaded Hungary. So he was, again, a Holocaust survivor who was never taken to any sort of camp, but you can kind of see the narrative. It's 80-year anniversary since the end of World War II today. So that's the kind of people we have sort of standing up for the Palestinians. And again, this doesn't really help their particular case. So again, the sort of comical narratives continue, this sort of Finkelstein type of approach. But we do see, again, in regards to what's happening in Lebanon, Conrad, it's being mirrored by West Bank and Gaza Palestinian action. So Israel is essentially multitasking. And not just that, again, you mentioned the Syrian front as well. There are 4 fronts, and Israel is also, again, strengthening its Iron Dome, protecting itself from the Houthi long-range bombardment. So Israel, in fact, is fighting on almost, you can say, 5 fronts, one of them being entirely domestic defensive with, well, again, American taxpayer dollars. And all the reactions that it's receiving from Hezbollah, from Hamas, from the Houthis, we have to understand that Israel was the first one who actually provoked the Palestinian strikes against itself, the Operation Liberation of Al-Aqsa, the Al-Aqsa flood, etc. All of that has very questionable roots, I would say. I mean, me and Conrad probably speculated on a few episodes prior as to what exactly prompted this exact operation on the 7th of October 2023. But in any case, we've seen the Israeli escalation really get out of hand. And in particular, the one place which we haven't seen a clear retaliation point for the Israelis against the Palestinian enemies is the West Bank. And in fact, this week, there's actually been a huge escalation in the West Bank, Conrad. There's been an arrest of over 20 Palestinians. And this is how the story goes. This is a great example of exactly how the Israelis conduct themselves. So a group of 22 or so Israeli settlers raided a Palestinian village of Jinba in the southwest bank. So this is near Hebron, somewhere just south of Jerusalem in the West Bank area. Palestinian village, it just gets raided by Israeli militia settlers. Very similar to what's happening in Ukraine when the Orthodox Christian Ukrainians of the Canonical Church are raided by these militiamen. And the Palestinians are not actually able to call the Israeli police because the police will not help them. And so these militiamen beat up Palestinians, send 6 of them to the hospital, and then the IDF moves in and arrests over 20 Palestinian villagers, sends most of them to prison for questioning, etc., interrogation. The Israeli settlers, there's no report on whether or not they were apprehended, whether or not they were addressed for their violence. And of course, the Palestinians are always seen as the culprits in these particular engagements. This is just one example in the village of Jinba in the West Bank. And many such stories, of course, have emerged, of course, over the past 20 years, but even more so, I think, going into the future as these Israeli Zionist settlers will continue expanding into native Muslim and even Christian land, because we have to understand most of the Christian real estate and the places where Christian Orthodox laity as well as monastics live are, of course, located in the West Bank. These are most of the holy areas: Hebron, Bethlehem, Mount Tabor, Jerusalem itself, etc., the Mount of Olives. And it's really concerning. This is, of course, where we are paying attention to the fact that, of course, the West Bank is one of the main areas that Israel would like to dominate in the near future. But of course, they haven't really commenced pushing for it yet. And I think one of the reasons, Conrad, for that, and one of the reasons why the Gaza operation is such a success, according to the Zionists, is because it is very much Islamically dominated. It's 98 or 99% Muslim. And so it's easy to play off that card that, well, it's just simply Islamic terrorists that we're dealing with. It's not, this Christian minority isn't really a factor. And so you can play off that Marco Rubio, the Pete Hegseth, Deus Volt type of rhetoric and say that, look, we're just here to defend Israel, our greatest ally, against these Islamic terrorists. That same narrative will not be possible to be played off out in the West Bank. I think you need a higher stage, a higher level of demonization of the Armenian Orthodox Church, of the Orthodox Eastern churches, but in particular the Russian Orthodox and the Greek communities there, which of course we haven't reached yet. Orthodox Christians, even in Ukraine, are somewhat supported by even figures such as J.D. Vance, the persecuted ones. So I think Israel really hasn't crafted a strong enough narrative yet to sort of begin the persecution of Christians, which is why they're taking the West Bank domination very slowly. They're approaching it in a very sort of sensible fashion. And again, when they can, they will always either blame or they will use their sort of HTS, ISIS patsies and scapegoats in order to, of course, kill Christians, for example, in Syria. That's probably the best example of it. So that's probably, in my understanding, why Gaza, the strip of land which for the Israelis is worth a lot less than the West Bank, is, of course, the first target, and why this genocide, including the so-called planned mass exodus of the Palestinians, is, of course, being spoken about so openly, because they don't see these Muslim Palestinians as people of any sort of value. They see them as goyim, as Gentiles who need to be shipped off to, again, one of the new countries they're proposing now is Indonesia, which is completely insane. I understand it's the most populated Muslim country on earth at the moment. There are over 300 million Muslims in Indonesia, but considering you want to move these native Middle Eastern Levantine people all the way to Southeast Asia, I think this is really a sign that Israel does want to dominate this entire landscape. And the Greater Israel Project is not just on the cards, it's being literally created before our very eyes. Every single episode that we cover the news in the Middle East, you see this more and more sort of come to fruition. And you look at the Gaza Strip, Conrad, every day, 20 to 30 Palestinians killed in bombardments, in various raids and operations. The genocide is very much still on foot. And the only solution to all of this is, according to the US cabinet and mainstream media in America, is that, well, we just have to send the Palestinians to a safe place such as Sudan or Somalia, Somaliland, Indonesia. It's just, that rhetoric is not helping. It's not Christian. And in some ways, as we said before, in some ways it's a retaliation for that Pale of Settlement discourse that took place amongst based Christian, Catholic, Protestant, and even Orthodox Christian politicians who wanted to send, the members of the Talmudic community somewhere to Madagascar or Uganda. They're using that same strategy now against their own native enemies in the land of Palestine, which is, I think, very interesting.
Yeah, the situation in the West Bank has been just much less covered because the Israelis haven't been, doom striking it like they are in Lebanon and Gaza, but it's very much an ongoing front that more people need to talk about. And hopefully we can even talk to somebody that's on the ground there in the near future on the show. But specifically talking about Gaza, this is from Middle East Eye. Hamas defiant after Israeli airstrike kills another high-profile figure in Gaza. An Israeli airstrike has killed Abdel Latif al-Kunaya, a spokesman for Hamas in northern Gaza. He was killed when his tent was targeted in the Jabalia refugee camp at dawn on Thursday, Al-Aqsa television reported. Several others were wounded in the attack. The Palestinian movement confirmed the death and has said the attack would only strengthen its resistance. The occupation's targeting of the movement's leaders and spokespeople will not break our will, but will only increase our determination to continue on the path of liberation, it said. Kunua is the latest high-profile figure for Hamas to be killed since Israel resumed the war last week in what appears to be a targeted assassination campaign. Earlier this week, Israel killed senior Hamas figures Salah al-Bardawil and Ismail Barhoum. Both were members of Hamas's 20-member Politburo. According to Hamas, sources cited by Reuters, 11 members of the decision-making body have been killed by Israel since the war began in October 2023. At least 855 people have been killed, over half of whom are children and women, since Israel broke the ceasefire last week. Israel's relentless bombardment of Gaza killed at least 20 Palestinians overnight and into the morning on Thursday, with many more wounded, according to Al Jazeera. Among the dead were at least 2 people who succumbed to their injuries after Israeli airstrikes targeted tents sheltering displaced families in Az-Zawaida, a town in central Gaza's Deir al-Balah government. So, obviously, it's very hard for the Gazans right now, and it appears the entire Hamas Politburo is being picked off one by one. I don't know exactly what the political situation is there. Obviously, I don't think they're capable of holding elections. I guess they could just replace them. I'm sure they have wartime protocols in place among, the civilian government there. But it appears that, again, you've got some of these guys are probably fighting on the ground themselves. So it's probably hard to actually conduct real political operations. I don't know how many of these tunnels, I'm sure there are still deep underground tunnels that haven't been hit yet, but I don't know the situation on the ground. We might have to talk to some more Arabic language people to actually start to get a look, because it appears things are deteriorating so fast that so many journalists have died as well that we might not even be able to get really accurate reports out for much longer. So we should really look into this. But the big news that people have been talking about, obviously, the Jewish press has been hyping up these big, supposedly anti-Hamas protests in the Gaza Strip. And I have CNN, though, actually talked to people here. It says, Hamas's government media office in Gaza told CNN that the anti-Hamas slogans were spontaneous and do not reflect the general national position. This is in reference to, in some of the videos of these anti-war protests, some people said some anti-Hamas things. He says it was a spontaneous rally against the war because people are tired and they have no place to go. One witness told Reuters news agency, many chanted slogans against Hamas, not all people, but many, saying, out Hamas, people are exhausted and no one should blame them. So, again, I don't know if there are political retaliations going on in the Gaza Strip if people go against Hamas. Obviously, any country, when there's a situation at war, this occurs. I mean, look at Ukraine, look at Russia, look at Armenia, Azerbaijan. When wartime powers are invoked, freedom of speech sort of, has to get put by the wayside for a little bit. But it appears that obviously there is growing discontent. I mean, if you live in Gaza, you know at least dozens of people that have been killed directly because of the war by the Israelis. And I'm sure while anger against the Israelis can sustain people for pretty long, it's been, well over a year now. Eventually, you're just going to, I don't want to say succumb, but you're going to demand that the people that you have immediate political recourse to bring this to an end. And obviously, at a certain level, Hamas does have not plausible deniability, but they can say that, look, we didn't break the ceasefire. So it isn't really their fault. But again, I don't know how many people in the Gaza Strip are aware of the whole Hamas being propped up by Israel kind of thing. And I don't put so much credence into that to where I think that these people like Yahya Sinwar dying in the Gaza Strip, these aren't like Israeli agents, but political circumstances and political realities are manipulated so that certain circumstances can benefit specific political actors, because it's not like Hamas being in power benefits Israel overall. It just benefits Netanyahu for his immediate, political aims and potentially a provocation to a more rapid fulfillment of the greater Israel project. So again, it's a very nuanced thing. People just say, oh, Hamas is funded by Israel, and they think it's a sort of shell organization thing. That's not really how it works. But I think the other big front that we need to, not really front, but unfortunate new potential front that we have to talk about is the Iran situation, which of course is kind of focused right now on Yemen. And as these Houthi strikes, continue, Trump, this is from anti-war Dave DeCamp, Trump says he will continue bombing Yemen for a long time. President Trump on Wednesday claimed that the U.S.'s daily airstrikes on Yemen have been very successful and vowed the bombing campaign would continue for a long time. The U.S. started bombing Yemen again on March 15th in response to the Houthis, officially known as Ansar Allah, announcing they would reimpose a blockade on Israeli shipping due to Israeli ceasefire violations in Gaza. Since the Trump administration launched the bombing campaign, the Houthis have restarted attacks on U.S. warships and resumed firing missiles at Israel, operations they ceased when the Gaza ceasefire went into effect on January 19th. Despite this, President Trump claims the Houthis want peace. The Houthis are looking to do something. They want to know, how do we stop? How do we stop? How can we have peace? The Houthis want peace because they're getting the hell knocked out of them, Trump told Reuters in the Oval Office. They want us to stop so badly, they've got to say no mas. But I can only say that the attacks every day, every night, have been very successful beyond our wildest expectations. We're going to do it for a long time. We can keep it going for a long time, the president said. The Houthis' message has been that they will meet escalation with escalation and that their attacks won't stop unless there is a ceasefire in Gaza and an end to the Israeli blockade on aid and all other goods entering the Palestinian territory. The Yemeni armed forces affirm that the American aggression will only increase the Yemeni steadfastness and resilience, and that the confrontations over the last few days were only the beginning of what will be a gradual expansion of defensive operations in the coming days, Houthi military spokesman Yahya Saree said on Thursday. So, obviously, as I said before, most of the Houthi missiles aren't even making it into Israel anymore. I don't know how successful they're being in actually blockading a lot of these ships. So it appears that Trump is right that they are having, quote unquote, great success with these strikes, because I think the Suez is probably flowing more than it was, back in the initial round of blockades that the Houthis did. So, we don't like to see this. Obviously, I'm against the strikes, but, Jackson Hinkle is in Yemen and he was meeting with Yahya Saree and these others. And then he gave a really, I don't even want to call it a speech. He just kind of yapped into the mic for a little bit in his Justin Trudeau style brown person getup. But look, that's not a good look for America. That's not a good look for Russia. It's not a good look for Yemen. I don't even know if it's a good look for Jackson Hinkle. It just is coal. So we don't need to dwell on that for too long. But unfortunately, that guy was over there. So whatever that means. To finish out this article, Trump also claimed that the Houthis are being hit harder than they have ever been. But from 2015 to 2022, the Houthis faced a brutal US-backed Saudi UAE war against them, which involved a heavy bombing campaign, a blockade, and a ground campaign. Trump supported the war during his first term in office and vetoed a war powers resolution passed by Congress that would have ended US involvement in the conflict. So, yeah, obviously the Saudi UAE thing is continuing to affect this. I think some people still have a dream that the Saudi-backed, or the UAE-backed Southern Transitional Council or one of these groups can, enter into power, but it's not true. The Houthis have the vast majority of Yemenis seem to support the Houthis compared to any of these other groups. So that seems to be what's going to happen there. I don't know if they still haven't been able to decapitate al-Houthi. I don't know if they're not taking him out on purpose or if they just can't get to him, because that would be sort of the decapitation strike. I'm sure he has a contingency plan in place, but just like Israel was able to kill Nasrallah and Hania, it seems that al-Houthi has managed to evade a direct strike. So I guess that's good for now. But the big, of course, gorilla behind, well, at least that the US would claim are behind the Houthis, is Iran. And obviously we know that the Houthis are able to do their military operations and, independently of Iran. Of course, there were those supposedly, this was a rumor that, 5 to 10 Quds Force members were killed in one of the strikes on Yemen. So obviously, much like NATO commanders are in Ukraine, there are some Iranian commanders in Yemen, but obviously the Houthis are able to do a lot of this there aren't that many direct supply lines between Iran and Western Yemen. So it's very clear that they do have their own supply bases and all these sorts of things. But the U.S. has been dramatically moving equipment to surround and confront and intimidate Iran. Obviously, that's a big part of what the strikes on the Houthis are, is a show of force against the Iranians. And this is from Dave DeCamp again. Iran responds to President Trump's letter proposing nuclear talks. Of course, last week we talked about the Trump letter to Iran, basically saying that you have 2 months to agree to some kind of nuclear deal with us or we're going to bomb you. And of course, the Ayatollah responded that you're the one that tore up the last nuclear agreement. So why should we trust you to do this? It seems that you're just intimidating us. So Dave DeCamp writes, Iranian Foreign Minister Abbas Araghchi said Thursday that Tehran has responded to President Trump's letter proposing nuclear talks that was sent to Iranian Supreme Leader Ayatollah Ali Khamenei. The official response comprises a letter wherein our viewpoints regarding the status quo and Mr. Trump's letter have been fully laid out and relayed to the other side, Araghchi said, according to Iran's IRNA news agency. Araghchi said the message was delivered through Oman, which has a history of mediating between the U.S. and Iran. He reiterated Iran's opposition to direct talks with the U.S. in the face of Trump's maximum pressure campaign, which has involved increasing sanctions and threats of military action. But Iran is leaving the door open to negotiations through intermediaries, something Araghchi also reaffirmed. Indirect negotiations, though, can continue as they existed in the past, he said. According to Axios, President Trump's letter to Khamenei gave Iran a 2-month deadline to reach a deal with the U.S. If an agreement isn't reached in time, the threat of U.S. or Israeli military action against Iran's nuclear program would rise significantly. Despite all the hype around Iran's nuclear program, U.S. intelligence agencies reaffirmed in their annual threat assessment that there's no evidence Tehran is working toward a nuclear weapon. And again, the Ayatollah literally has a fatwa against nuclear weapons. The hype over Iran's nuclear program revolves around the enrichment of some uranium at 60%, the highest level Iran has achieved, but still lower than the 90% needed for weapons grade. Iran first took the step to enrich at 60% in response to a 2021 Israeli sabotage attack against the Natanz nuclear facility, which was meant to sabotage talks between the Biden administration and Tehran. Iran is still a signatory to the Non-Proliferation Treaty and has told the International Atomic Energy Agency that it won't enrich uranium beyond the 60% level. Amid increasing U.S. and Israeli threats about its nuclear program, Iran has recently pointed out that Israel has a secret nuclear weapons stockpile, and its nuclear program is not subject to IAEA inspection since Israel is not a signatory of the Non-Proliferation Treaty. If you want to hear more about this, we do discuss this in the Ether Hour with Jay Dyer, because fundamentally, this illegal secret nuclear program by Israel is the reason that John F. Kennedy was assassinated. So, very important history for Americans. But in the midst of all of this, of course, Israeli media, close friends of Netanyahu even, are saying that an Israeli strike on Iran's nuclear capabilities is imminent. And of course, we've been hearing this for a long time, but it appears that even the people talking in Trump's ear are convincing them that this is true. And I don't think Israel is going to directly strike Iran's nuclear capabilities without at least a small head nod from the United States. But the big thing that's happening right now, of course, is I believe it's 5 or 6 B-2 stealth bombers have been moved to Diego Garcia, which for those that don't know, Diego Garcia, where I do believe that Malaysian Airlines flight was teleported to. But putting that aside, this is, of course, where a lot of U.S. strikes on the Iraq War took place from. It's down in the Indian Ocean, and it shows the sort of long-range capability of American fighters. And of course, it is within range of Iran for these large fighters, or these large bombers that can carry a very heavy payload. And between that and, U.S. carriers in the Red Sea and around the Persian Gulf, as well as other planes that have been moved to U.S. bases in the region, the Diego Garcia thing especially is showing that, again, I'm sure Trump thinks that it's a show of force, that it's going to get the Iranians to come to the table. But when you sort of give Israel these ambiguous signals and they take 6 inches and turn it into a mile, and next thing you know, they're striking Iran and you are forced to back them up, all of this buildup and all this hype is it's gonna serve their escalatory interests, not necessarily your attempts at de-escalation through a show of force, which obviously we understand Trump has been doing for a long time. So, Dimitri, I'd love to hear your thoughts on, what's going on with Iran right now and, these new bombers and, is this strike imminent? Are we going to see Israel do it?
I think, Conrad, we are definitely going to see something in 2025. Our predictions were, of course, given in previous videos, most likely this year, being the first year of the Trump second-term presidency, gives him a long period of time to end or sort of commence and then progress any sort of conflict in the Middle East. And arguably, if he is serving the Zionist cause, which I think there is some suspicion that he may be an ally of that, then I think 2025 is the best time for the American super powerful war machine to actually begin some sort of long-term destructive wartime project to support Israel in the Middle East. Now's the time prior to any sort of recession, economic problem, or even technological deterioration, or before countries like China, India, before the BRICS nations catch up in terms of technology. And we'll speak about that technology in a moment when we talk about the B-2 stealth bombers, which I think are fascinating sort of creations of the American military industrial complex. But Iran, sort of in answer to the hawkish rhetoric from Donald J. Trump, as well as the American government cabinet, has released a very interesting 90-second, minute-and-a-half video montage of an underground missile facility. A lot of people have probably seen this circulating on X. It is actually officially from Persia. It's from the Iranian regime. It shows Iranian generals driving around in like a jeep in these huge underground tunnels with these bombs, missiles sort of stacked along the sides. It looked really sort of futuristic, but some analysts have already noted that this is one of 3 underground missile storage, sort of missile underground base. They call it Missile City in, the Americans have begun calling it that. It's one of 3 videos that Iran has released over the last 5 years. They don't actually provide that much information to their, literally geopolitical enemies at this point. But the video does show some vulnerabilities. For example, the munitions storage apparently is not up to scratch. The tunnels are a little bit too open, not that many doors, there's large chasms. There's no blast doors anywhere to be seen, sort of an absence of stabilizing features. So people have already broken this video down. By people, I mean literally those working for like OPSEC in America, and they've sort of shown that Iran is not really up to scratch in terms of its missile storage in these mountains, right? These underground huge tunnels and caves, which we know that even the Taliban has developed in Afghanistan. And as you can imagine, Conrad, since 1979, it's been close to 50 years. What exactly the Persians have been up to, building up their own sovereign defense systems within their own land. I mean, as they should, frankly. Without sort of nuclear technology, they needed to store these long-range missiles. And in particular, we're talking about the K-Bar Shakan, Ghadar H, the Sejil, and of course the Pavel long-range cruise missiles. This is land-to-land, so they can, of course, fly very long distances. But the shocking thing was that, again, the movement of these B-2 bombers to Diego Garcia Islands. Now, these islands were controlled by the British Empire, coincidentally, the most Talmudic Freemasonic, literally, empire on the planet since the Napoleonic Wars. It took control of this Diego Garcia Islands then and still controls them to this day. Of course, they're being leased out to the American military. And this particular airbase, the reason why it's so conveniently placed, as you said, in the Indian Ocean is because of all the BRICS countries, Conrad, India is the friendliest one, to America, arguably. You can say perhaps South Africa is, but India, in terms of its trade agreements, its dependence, even the Bollywood culture being based off of Hollywood, and of course the obsession of Israel, that those relations really do work. And of course, the Diego Garcia Islands being somewhat vulnerable. To the east, they have Australia, which is an American ally. To the north, they have India and Sri Lanka, which, again, are not really a threat. They're perfectly positioned in order to strike against the Middle East. And just for distance sake, just picture this. The Diego Garcia Island is 2,400 miles away from Persia and Yemen, which is insane. You wouldn't think a plane would be able to, without refueling, go from the airbase all the way to bomb and then, of course, return back. It can be refueled in the air, which is, of course, incredible, technologically speaking. It's also a stealth aircraft. 55-meter wingspan means it can't really land on any of the aircraft carriers, such as the Carl Vinson or the Harry S. Truman, which are located in the Red Sea right now, bombing the Houthis and the Yemenis. They've killed, again, tens of people this week. There's been all kinds of air raids against the Houthis in Yemen. But these B-2 bombers haven't been utilized yet. So this is the biggest question. Will these B-2 bombers, which can drop bunker busters, like very heavy munitions, which have this unique technology, because the bombs are so heavy and they have this like armor-piercing capacity, they can break through steel, concrete, rock, and apparently they can strike targets very deep underground. Like they are literally made for that, and their weight dropped from these B-2 bombers, which are huge. Again, only piloted by 2 people. It's quite incredible. They can most likely reach some of these deep Iranian facilities. So, and in my reckoning, Conrad, I don't think we'll see B-2 bombers fly over Iran, in the short term, but we may see the B-2 bombers utilized against some of these underground Houthi bases in Yemen, which unfortunately I don't think they're as safe and as well built as those of Iran and Persia. So I think there may be a test run, especially for some of these new pilots who perhaps haven't been involved in those B-2 bombardments during the Iraq War and, of course, the Gulf War in the 90s. These are, for the new pilots, 25 years and over. For the youngsters, they may need that experience to fly these big machines and drop these massive bombs on like a maybe more, shall we say, safer target. And the fact that they're stealth-based means that, unlike the Reaper drones, which the Houthis have shot down over the last year and a half, or they shot down over 9 Reaper drones, these B-2 bombers will be relatively safe. I don't believe the Houthis have any anti-stealth, anti-air missile technology. They obviously don't have any S-400 systems. As we know, Syria didn't even have any S-400 systems when the Israelis were bombing the Syrian airports and bases. So it's incredibly concerning. As exactly how India will react, how the BRICS countries, what will they state? Because 7 B-2 bombers located in Diego Garcia, just for reference, is close to half of the operational B-2 bombers in the entire US Air Force. Because they always have some running on maintenance, and there's roughly only about 20 or 19 in circulation. So it's close to half of the B-2 bombers in the entire US Air Force. And so you might think, 7 bombers, what can they really do? But these things can drop literally nuclear bombs like over Hiroshima and Nagasaki. So it's quite the destructive weapon. And the question will be, will these Russian S-400 plus systems, which allegedly the Russian state can actually detect stealth aircraft, will they be able to defend Iran when that conflict escalates? And again, if they strike a nuclear facility or a nuclear sort of testing facility in Iran, what will be the ecological outfall of that, right? Similar, like if you think theoretically dropping a bomb onto a nuclear reactor, what kind of effect would that have? We remember the Zaporozhye nuclear power plant in Energodar near the Dnieper River. Remember all the escalatory talks, people were talking about second Chernobyl taking place in the central Ukraine. Well, there may be several Chernobyls in the Iranian Persian mountains in the near future if the Israelis and the Americans and the American deep state has their way. So it's incredibly concerning. But I do think in the near future, Conrad, we may see the B-2 bombers flying over Yemen in terms of actually testing out some of their long-range capacities, and again, probably as a test run, and maybe even a show of force. Like the show of force escalation, if you sort of look at it gradually and progressively, it would be to use them against the Yemenis. They already have 2 aircraft carriers wasting both American taxpayer dollars and petrol and fuel, and of course these expensive munitions, which they use. It's that old conundrum, right? We're going to use a $5 million bomb to drop it on a $50 tent in the Yemenis desert, right? It's not really economically sustainable. So they might be using, again, more of these huge destructive weapons against the Yemenis Houthis, who are a terrorist-labeled organization, which is, again, unfortunately, that the Yemenis Houthis, right, they are very sort of extreme in their approach. Again, they're not really looking for peace. They're willing to sabotage the entire Red Sea trade route, but we can't really judge them because, again, almost the entire world, besides, of course, some of the BRICS countries, has watched on and seen these Palestinians be massacred and genocided over the past 2 years without any proper reaction or retaliation. So the Houthis really are the only real military force, besides, of course, the Hezbollah and some others, who have actually taken some sort of consistent step towards protecting their Islamic brothers. And as we said last week, Conrad, our only hope is that in the future, if some Christian country is involved in a war, for example, even Armenia, who are apostolic Christians, would another Orthodox Christian country stand up for them and defend them? I'm not even sure we Orthodox Christians have that sort of solidarity. So it'll be very interesting how this escalates. And again, simply having those bombers, and not in a vulnerable position, again, they're very safe on Diego Garcia, but having those bombers there, I think, speaks volumes about what exactly Donald J. Trump's next move will be. And part of me, Conrad, really doesn't see him being a peacetime president. I think we're going to see a huge escalation in the Middle East very soon.
When you mentioned Orthodox solidarity, I'm forgetting the name of the Greek NATO admiral or ship commander who refused to take his ship to fire on Serbia when NATO started to bomb them, and I think he was dismissed. He has since been, awarded many times over in Serbia. So we can hope that more and more people like that are empowered in the militaries of Orthodox countries. But before we discuss sort of the U.S. signal leaks about these Houthi strikes, which will take us to the U.S. for a bit, we do need to discuss the other Middle Eastern country that has, very prophetic realities to it. Of course, we know that when the Iranian nuclear strikes happen, obviously everyone's going to be on watch because, St. Paisios, St. Theodore Agiopharagides of Crete, as well as, of course, Metropolitan Neophytos, talk a lot about what will happen when the Israelis strike the Iranian nuclear program. And the other main geopolitical event that will, I think, either precede or immediately succeed those strikes will be the fall of Erdogan in Turkey, of course. And, of course, the huge protests that have been going on there ever since the arrest of Imamoglu have been making everybody in the geopolitical analysis sphere discussing the future of Turkey. Of course, it's been very deep. Frankly, Turkey's never necessarily been super stable. It's been a very powerful country, succeeding a lot geopolitically, but also very destabilized with its economic problems, with its huge earthquakes that occur now with this major political unrest. This is from the Cradle. Turkey arrests nearly 2,000 in anti-government protests, calls Western backlash double standards. Ankara rejected accusations that the arrest of Ekrem Imamoglu was to prevent him from running in the next presidential election. I'm not sure who's going to believe that. But it goes on. Turkey's Justice Minister Yilmaz Tunç defended the arrest of Istanbul Mayor Ekrem Imamoglu on the 27th of March, calling international reactions prejudiced and a result of double standards, while insisting the case was based on serious criminal allegations, not political motives. Imamoglu, a prominent opposition figure from the Republican People's Party, CHP, was jailed on the 23rd of March and is pending trial on charges of corruption. His arrest has sparked nationwide protests and condemnations from rights groups in Western nations. Interior Minister Ali Yerlikaya said nearly 1,900 protesters have been detained since last week. Speaking to international media in Istanbul, Tunç rejected claims that Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdogan influenced the judiciary to sideline a potential presidential challenger. We absolutely reject any affiliation of the probe with President Erdogan and any political motives behind the investigation, he added. He said, adding that the arrest was based on the gravity of the evidence and the risk of tampering with it. Imamoglu's arrest came just days before the CHP was set to nominate him as its 2028 presidential candidate. CHP supporters accuse Erdogan of orchestrating Imamoglu's arrest to remove him as a challenger in Turkey's next presidential election. Analysts speculate that Erdogan may call for an earlier election to allow himself to run for president once again. Because Erdogan has led Turkey for 22 years, Parliament would need to approve an earlier election as he will have reached his term limit by the scheduled date. Authorities say Imamoglu is implicated in two separate investigations, one involving alleged ties to the outlawed Kurdistan Workers' Party, the PKK, and another concerning bribery, corruption, and data fraud tied to a public tender scheme. The Justice Minister said that case includes reports from financial crime investigators and testimony linked to a leaked money counting video featuring CHP-affiliated individuals. He called for patience, urging Turkey's European friends to respect the independence of the judiciary and avoid interfering in ongoing legal proceedings. Some statements by the international community show that this basic principle is disregarded. He said, "We absolutely reject such prejudiced attitudes with double standards." The CHP has called for continued public demonstrations, while Erdogan dismissed the protests as a show, warning of legal consequences to participants. Well, we did see a guy dressed as Pikachu running through the protests, which I thought was pretty funny. We've also seen a lot of Kemalist signs and, pro-Turkish nationalist posters, people dressing up, Turkey, pretty interesting country. But as far as Erdogan calling a new election, he just won the election in 2023. I don't think he's going to call an earlier one. If anything, he's going to wait till the next one gets called and hope that everyone just forgets that Imamoglu not only got arrested, but also got his university degree revoked, which already disqualifies him from even running for president. So obviously maybe some of these charges are legitimate, but this idea that Erdogan had nothing to do with this, we're not stupid. I don't think anyone's going to believe this. And if anything, these statements from the justice minister, I almost feel like they're just going to provoke the protests even more. And again, I feel like maybe Erdogan behind the scenes feels that he's more secure than he really is. But again, this could lead to events that precipitate his fall. And again, Erdogan, the Greek, some people consider him like a secret Greek, despite, making Hagia Sophia a mosque. But everybody in Greece understands that Kemalists, these more secular people coming to power, it won't mean anything for Greece. It won't help them. If anything, it might put the islands in danger because the West will no longer be on guard about Turkey and Erdogan, and they may be willing to, again, like I said, in a situation where Europe really needs Turkey's military, and let's say Macron, who's a huge enemy of Turkey, let's say he loses in the future, then we could see, okay, look, you guys can take Lesbos and part of Crete, and you can keep Cyprus, and you get these places, and you just have to help us in this war against Russia. So we can see how all of this leads to a very prophetic situation. But if you have any thoughts on Turkey, Dimitri, I'd love to hear it. But we have to talk about the signal leaks with the Hegseth and Vance chats about the Houthi stuff too.
No, absolutely. I think, look, the Turkey protests, they're still developing. Of course, the story is still kind of breaking through. We are covering it on our Telegram, but just for our listeners to sort of keep up with the news, yes, the protest has been over 70 people arrested at the moment. There's been a BBC journalist actually literally told to leave the country, Mark Lowen, which is interesting because a few weeks ago, Conrad, we did speak about the Azeri Baku BBC office being closed forcefully. So that's interesting. The BBC Turkic confrontation, I think, is building, which is something we didn't expect in the world of geopolitics. But, that's maybe a deep discourse for another day. I think the fact that Erdogan himself was actually an active protester in the 90s. He was temporarily arrested. He was actually a big Istanbul member of the protest crowd. Shows you the sort of hypocritical approach. I think liberal democracy in and of itself, the fact that, well, you either get elected or you have a Maidan type revolution, both are legitimate, both are possible options. This is the fake and homoerotic reality that we live in today, right? This is the reality is protesting is like a natural sort of thing in today's liberal world. And Erdogan himself, like he can't hypocritically say that these protests are somewhat illegal when he himself in the 90s was a big pusher of the protests. So again, it's just not that I'm supportive of them. It's just seemingly the system itself is built. It's a colossi on clay legs. So there's that to sort of, I think, consider. And of course, many journalists have been arrested. We're not, again, for that. It's just, if we recall correctly, there seems to be a certain consistent model across the entire second to first world that if there are protests that do not serve a certain regime's cause, for example, the January 6th protests, or even the Russian patriotic protests from 2010 to 2011, the Russian marches, for example, the right-wing nationalist monarchist marches in Russia against certain liberal policies, they will get shut down by the regime that's in place. Or even, for example, Igor Strelkov being put behind bars for literally no reason whatsoever. So we just have to keep that in mind. A liberal democratic model under which the entire world runs and which every country seems to adapt and edit to suit their own ideologies are very much based on a very Enlightenment Freemasonic model of reality. And it's very much, I think, the spectrum of whether or not you're elected legally or you come to power through some sort of Maidan-type protest. I think it's a very dynamic and flexible spectrum. And you'll notice that it's very easy, for example, for Russia to legitimately claim that someone like Poroshenko and the Maidan crowd were at first illegitimate, but tomorrow they'll be legitimized in the same way as claiming that Zelensky is illegitimate because he hasn't been voted. It's just, I'm not claiming that these are good people. It's just the hypocrisy, I think, is very obvious because, again, we're not big supporters of liberal democracy in any way, even that in Turkey. But yes, of course, the signal leaks were, of course, one of the biggest stories. I think we mentioned this on our episode of JDI towards the end. One of the most fascinating things is that, the Atlantic newspaper, like that journalist who leaked the signal chat, he was, of course, working for The Atlantic. We know The Atlantic is a very Democrat-centric, very left-wing liberal publication. It's literally owned by Lauren Powell Jobs, the widow of Steve Jobs, who ran Apple. I won't really comment on the deceased Mr. Jobs, but we have to keep in mind that Lauren Powell Jobs, she was good friends of Ghislaine Maxwell, right? Epstein's girlfriend. So sort of allowing this Atlantic journalist to simply waltz into the chat, leak everything with no consequences whatsoever, Conrad, I think it speaks volumes about the complacency of the American cabinet. And look, there's a lot of reason to believe that those chats were actually real. I know some people are saying maybe they're faked. There's no way, J.D. Vance and Pete Hegseth are just joking about the Yemen strikes in some sort of chat room. But we've literally seen Russian commanders, as we mentioned on the episode of J. Dyer, chatting in Telegram, officers, sergeants, lieutenants, Russian generals just chatting to their chatting to their troops in Telegram chats, like closed, obviously, and encrypted, but still. So, in fact, in the modern technological world, these apps and these various softwares, which are allegedly encrypted, are being used by people in the highest positions of power, people literally in war, in the trenches, fighting for their respective countries. So, I think it's just incredibly curious. And yeah, it says a lot really about how much you can actually trust journalists. And frankly, apparently it was a misclick. Someone, the Atlantic journalist was simply added by mistake. But still, I think, it does humanize the American leaders somewhat. Like, look, these guys just hang out in a group chat just like us, right? They're just like me. But on the other hand, it does speak to the improfessionalism in some way. Like, this really does speak to the fact that, look, maybe we are run by these like lunatics and imbeciles who are joking and sort of making these weird quips about striking an entire new country, essentially declaring war on the Yemenese people. So very concerning, I think.
Yeah, there's a lot of conspiracy theories flying. Some people think this was intentionally leaked. Some people obviously are trying to get Mike Waltz, who supposedly was the one that added Jeffrey Goldberg. Again, hilarious name. But they claim that he was the one that added him to the chat. And of course, Waltz has always been kind of the most hawkish one within the cabinet as national security advisors. So now some people that are less hawkish are maybe using this as an opportunity to call for him to be kicked out. But Trump says he's not going to fire anybody. Trump seems to be fairly unperturbed by this. But I just wanted to comment. I mean, for those that don't know what was said in the chats, I think some of the most notable revelations, they claim that a active undercover female CIA officer's name was mentioned by the CIA director, because Tulsi Gabbard and a few others were also in the chat. But the big thing that people were noticing was J.D. Vance basically being the only one that was kind of skeptical or expressing, reservations about the strikes on the Houthis. J.D. Vance said, "At Pete Hegseth, if you think we should do it, let's go. I just hate bailing Europe out again. Let's just make sure our messaging is tight here. And if there are things we can do up front to minimize risk to Saudi oil facilities, we should do it." And then Pete Hegseth said, "VP, I fully share your loathing of European freeloading. It's pathetic, but Mike is correct. We're the only ones on the planet, on our side of the ledger, who can do this. Nobody else is even close. Question is timing. I feel like now is as good a time as any. Given POTUS directive to reopen shipping lanes, I think we should go. But POTUS still retains 24 hours of decision space." And again, look, I guess I'm somewhat grateful that J.D. Vance was expressing some reservation, but I mean, this is getting to crazy levels of like avoiding naming the Jew. So we're bailing out by striking the Houthis, Europe. That's who's being helped here. It's just crazy, like, and we're protecting Saudi oil. They're just desperate to not talk about Israel because they know that obviously it's unpopular. They know that apparently even behind closed doors, people are afraid to admit that they're just enslaved to Israel, even when they are. But Europe doesn't, Europe is already, we're forcing Europe to pay for their NATO stuff. We're hanging them out to dry with all this Ukraine stuff, apparently. And somehow they're also getting the blame for the war in the Middle East, when in reality, I think you can trace world Jewry and Israel back on both of those issues. So in a way, this is some like kind of anti-white nonsense from J.D. Vance, who, of course, has an Indian wife and Indian children. But the willingness to just blame, I mean, is that what the future of Europe is? It's just going to be, not only do they get blamed for all the world's problems by these colonies and by these, non-white countries, but now America is just going to join in on the pile-on and just blame Europe for everything as well. So I think it's, again, these leaks, they don't seem to be having that much political fallout. I don't know what Jeffrey Goldberg thought was going to happen by leaking them. Maybe he thought that Hegseth would get kicked out, because I know Hegseth is, I think, he's the most slimly approved by the Senate Secretary of Defense in American history. So I think people might view him as weak, or maybe able to be, targeted by a lot of the soft power media manipulation stuff. But speaking of J.D. Vance, of course, something that's perhaps a little more interesting to what's going on this show was J.D. Vance's visit to Greenland. He was there. He met with some U.S. troops there, talked to them about how cold it was and about how it's so important that while the military shouldn't get involved, it's desperately important that Greenland come under the U.S. sphere of influence in some capacity. This is from a local Dallas-Fort Worth NBC station that covered it. It says, Vice President J.D. Vance argued on Friday that Greenlanders would be better off being under the protection of the U.S. than under Denmark. Vance's remarks came as a U.S. delegation that included the Vice President, Second Lady Usha Vance, and National Security Advisor Mike Waltz visited an American military base in Greenland. But yeah, basically, Trump is saying we don't want to get the military involved. Trump is also saying that he thinks that Denmark and the Europeans understand how important it is, but if they don't, then the U.S. might have to take matters into its own hands. But, this visit, which was People have been knowing about it for weeks now. And these comments, the aggressive Trump posture towards Greenland has elicited some, finally, an actual acknowledgement from Putin, which again, everyone knew that this is all about encountering Russia in the Arctic Circle. This is from Newsweek. It says Putin issues Arctic conflicts warning over Trump's Greenland plans. Russian President Vladimir Putin warned that members of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization are increasingly designating the far north as a staging area for possible conflicts, while talking about President Donald Trump's plan about the United States acquiring Greenland. Trump has repeatedly spoken about his desire for the U.S. to take over Greenland, telling reporters on Tuesday that America should go as far as we have to go to gain control of the Arctic island, which is an autonomous territory in the Kingdom of Denmark. He has previously said that annexing Greenland is needed for world security. Politicians in Greenland and Denmark have firmly rejected the idea, but Trump has not ruled out military action, and fears are ongoing about the far-reaching consequences of Trump making a move. There are worries about how an American takeover of Greenland, both NATO countries, could affect the alliance and how it could provoke Moscow, which has already warned Washington against acquiring Greenland. In January, Federation Council Chairwoman Valentina Matviyenko said that the Arctic should be a territory of peace and harmony, per reports from the Russian news service Interfax. Now, ahead of President J.D. Vance's visit to the Arctic island, a trip that has drawn criticism from Greenlandic and Danish officials, Putin has spoken out about Trump's plans. Putin spoke in an Arctic forum in Murmansk, a city in northern Russia, on Thursday, the second day of the policy forum. As for Greenland, this is a question that concerns two specific countries and has nothing to do with us. But at the same time, of course, we are only concerned about the fact that NATO countries as a whole are increasingly designating the far north as a staging area for possible conflicts, practicing the use of troops in these conditions, including with the forces of their new recruits, Finland and Sweden, with whom, by the way, we have had no problems at all until recently, the Russian leader said. He added, for some reason, they are creating it with their own hands. Why? It is completely incomprehensible, but nevertheless, we will proceed from what is and will respond to all of this. Finland and Sweden are NATO's newest members who joined the alliance after Russia invaded Ukraine in February 22. Putin brought up America's acquisition of Alaska in 1867 when the Andrew Johnson administration bought the territory from Russia for $7.2 million. This period was one of multiple times that America has looked into buying Greenland. The United States of America had such plans back in the 1860s, the Russian president said. Even then, the American administration considered the possibility of annexing Greenland and Iceland, but this idea did not receive support from Congress. He added, let me remind you that by 1868, American newspapers were ridiculing the purchase of Alaska. It was called Madness and Icebox, the polar bear garden of Andrew Johnson. So the Greenland proposal failed. But today, the acquisition of Alaska is certainly assessed in the United States itself quite differently, just like the activities of President Andrew Johnson. Well, that's cringe. We don't need too much praising of Andrew Johnson on here. But obviously, this is the first time Putin has responded directly to the Arctic situation. He also has talked about the need for Russia to increase their military and merchant icebreaker fleet, as well as military actions in the region. So what are your thoughts on all of this, Dimitri? Arctic World War III incoming?
Look, I think it's on the cards in the near future, but I think both countries are seeking to develop further, right? The US, clearly, NATO is looking to include Greenland into its particular sphere of influence. And I say most likely the US first and foremost, because NATO is, arguably there's a lot of pro-Russian spokespersons, political commentators who say that if the Ukrainian debacle ends tragically, NATO may in fact collapse, and maybe these countries will just stop investing in this relative alliance which doesn't give anything, right? Hopefully, that's the sort of connection here that we'll be drawing. But nevertheless, of course, Finland, Sweden did enter NATO in just recent years. So frankly, it's hard to see this alliance really divide itself by zero in the near future. So it'll be hard to see this entire alliance collapse in the near future because so much has been invested into it. And in fact, Trump and the leader of NATO have, of course, spoken very closely, and they seem to have common goals. But just as the US is seeing Greenland, and you see J.D. Vance just today arrive and sort of, again, look at the threats that J.D. Vance has labeled for the people of Greenland. He said that, unfortunately, the government of Denmark hasn't foreseen the dangers that China and Russia poses for the people of Greenland. And so it's, again, this painting of BRICS as the main enemy. This economic alliance apparently are a threat to the people of Greenland and all the settlers there, which, again, is a bit insane. But the Russians are doing something very interesting and similar. They're also attempting to expand into the Arctic through other means. Now, the Russians, of course, control a large portion of the Arctic simply through their proximity to it, through the landmass of Siberia, the tundra, Arkhangelsk, Romanov on the Murom, now known as Murmansk, renamed by the Bolshevik Soviets. But naturally, since the time of Ivan the Great, since the 1550s, 1560s, Russia has expanded so heavily across that Arctic in response to the fact that the English fleet was actually sailing across the Arctic, exploring those lands, trying to find an alternative route to the Americas. And so the Russians are, of course, set up these big cities. For example, Arkhangelsk was the first port with proper cannons, defensive towers, etc., which the Russians then leased out and actually provided to the English. But the Russians needed to get to the Arctic first. And this race that we're seeing today is a recreation of that race of the 1500s. But instead of England, it's Russia and America competing. And the Russians are now, especially Russian lawmaker, member of the Duma, Sergei Mironov, he actually proposed something quite incredible. He said, look, the island of Spitsbergen, this is the Svalbard archipelago, but Spitsbergen is the biggest island there, which Russians have been sailing to and using for the last 300, 400 years. So Russian presence in Spitsbergen has been very active over the last few centuries. He's saying, look, we just need to take this island or make a deal with Norway and take the island for Russia, or at least lease it out or something like that. And I mean, it's a pretty interesting proposal. We actually spoke about Spitsbergen, that island, recently. I mean, maybe a few episodes ago. So in fact, we did talk about the scenario of, its renaming, Russia actually expanding into this particular area in order to improve its presence in the Arctic. One of the main reasons is, of course, the economic consideration, the trade of China to Europe. Of course, the European consumer base is so heavy and large, and the Chinese have all the goods that they need to send to Europe. One of the common shipping route is, of course, past the Indian Ocean, through Southeast Asia, of course, and then through the Suez Canal and the Red Sea. That route can be shortened by almost half if those Chinese ships sail north around the around the Arctic, north and all the way into Europe through that particular way. But Russia will need to grant protectorship to its BRICS neighbor, to all these shipping merchant fleets, etc. So it's a very interesting consideration. And the other thing is that, unfortunately, like, the Russian relationship with Norway isn't a very friendly one. Norway is, of course, a founding member of NATO since 1949. It isn't a member of the EU, which is a little bit interesting. But Norway is also run by a monarchy, and Russia isn't a monarchy, which, frankly, the future of the Norwegian monarchy is, of course, in dire straits, because the princess, the heir to the throne after Harald V, who is the king of Norway at the moment, is a constitutional monarchy, by the way. So again, with a grain of salt, we sort of proclaim these things. She's currently married to a African-American occultist named Durek Verret. So this white princess is married to this black Californian man who believes in David Icke-style reptilian conspiracy theories and all these other things. He calls himself a neo-shaman, and he lives in Norway in the Norwegian court. So just for consideration, that's the heir to the throne of Norway. Very unfortunate, because most of us would say, well, what if Russia restores the Tsardom, and then there could be like some sort of familial relation between the two houses, and maybe then Spitsbergen can fall under some sort of joint crown of Russia and Norway united. It's like, unfortunately, the Norwegians are being culturally enriched as we speak, including the most highly placed in their society. So maybe those dreams will kind of fall under before they're even taken up. But Sergei Mironov mentioned that if Russia does take Spitsbergen and the entire archipelago located there in the Arctic Ocean, which is very close to Greenland, by the way, it should be renamed to the Pomorskia Island, the Pomordia Islands, which is a pretty cool name. That's the name of the Pomor people. They're the Russians who lived on that coastline in the Arctic, in Murmansk as well as Arkhangelsk, etc. So I think the name is somewhat sweet. It's a lot better than Svalbard or whatever the Norwegians call it. But in any case, I think, given Russia's relations with Norway, the fact that it's a member of NATO, I think these dreams are going to be falling under very soon. I mean, Russia at the moment is struggling to even annex certain parts of Ukraine, legally speaking. So again, we can't really be making these very speculative takes, Conrad, without, of course, providing these huge disclaimers to our lovely listeners. Again, it would be nice in a perfect world, but we can't be making any sort of promises. So unfortunately, I think the Greenland debacle with J.D. Vance traveling there, the fact that Greenland is sort of very NATO-adjacent landmass, is very much more realistic than any sort of Russian expansion in the Arctic. Russia already has a very strong position in the region. I don't think it necessarily even requires that archipelago that belongs to Norway. But what's interesting, of course, all of this is spoken about in relation to the Russo-Ukrainian war, because at the moment, until we actually find out exactly how that conflict ends, there won't be really any necessary peace treaty between Russia and the European countries that will lead to sort of any relations. But we can't really speak about Russo-Norwegian relations until this particular conflict ends. There doesn't seem to be any end in sight. In fact, the peace treaty has seemingly fallen through. Ukrainians are attempting to strike at some of the oil facilities located just to the west of Rostov-on-Don. Some of those oil refineries located very close to the Ukrainian war zone, the SMO zone, in particular because those oil refineries are, of course, providing fuel to the Russian military which again, the Ukrainians are seeing as so-called military targets, despite the fact that the oil refineries are operated by civilians. They're located next to civilian towns and villages, but we do know that Ukrainians are not really discerning as to if they're striking at civilians or any other Russian military targets. And we see a general stalemate on that entire Tadetsk-Pokrovsk area. They're still fighting over some smaller villages around Tadetsk and Pokrovsk. But in case anyone was wondering, like, have the Russians finally surrounded Pokrovsk? The answer would be seemingly no. Pokrovsk still remains unsurrounded. The Russians have sort of halted their progression beyond the few villages which we mentioned last week. There hasn't been any sort of proper expansion. There's some fighting around Chasiv Yar and Kupiansk, which we also mentioned in the last few weeks. But again, it seems like the major focus is on that Belgorod, Bryansk, Kursk regions, which even the media is speaking about. In fact, President Putin gave a recent press conference, which he stated very openly that the Russians are seeking to take the entirety of Kursk very soon. And in fact, the Ukrainians are not in a good position. He's saying we're actually dominating on all the sides of the front line, which is true. Just the fact that some of the front lines are stable and neutral, for example, Zaporozhye and Kherson, does not mean that Russians are not in a favorable position. Russians, the fact that they're in these particular oblasts, which belong to Ukraine prior to February 2022, already means that Russia is in a favorable position. They are, in fact, according to international law, they are occupying Ukrainian lands. And so, in fact, we have to just openly state that they are in an advantageous position. Regarding the energy discourse and the talks in America and between the Ukrainians and Americans, a lot of Ukrainian politicians have been complaining that the Zelensky mineral deal of allowing, of course, the Americans to take over Ukrainian resources is, of course, something that Zelensky did not warn the Ukrainian members of parliament and members of the Verkhovnaya Rada about. There's a lot of anonymous Ukrainian members of parliament who are giving these anonymized interviews. They're not revealing their names, most likely because the repercussions for them revealing some of this infighting within the Ukrainian political system could lead to their prompt assassinations or imprisonment, again, for being agents of Russia, apparently, or even members, even Poroshenko is kind of on the cusp of being sent to prison. We have even seen Igor Kolomoisky, the great oligarch of the Dnipropetrovsk, is still sitting in prison in Ukraine somewhere. So it's very much a situation where no one's really safe in this new Ukraine, which has been flooded with Western fiat currency at the moment. This is very much a bounty hunter type zone. But we do note that there's been a lot of discourse about the Zaporozhye nuclear power plant, which we mentioned earlier in relation to Iran. In particular, the Ukrainians are arguing that we really need this nuclear power plant. Whatever borders will be drawn, despite the fact that it's located on the eastern shore of the Dnieper, it needs to be given over to Ukraine. That Energodar city adjacent to the nuclear power plant of Zaporozhye needs to be provided to Ukraine because it powers the city of Dnipropetrovsk. And, amongst the Russians, there's been a lot of conspiracies that Dnipro was the shadow capital of the USSR in the 1950s onwards, in particular because Nikita Khrushchev was from around this area, and even Gorbachev's mother was from Ukraine. And this is why the Igor Kolomoisky crowd, as well as some of his underlings, and a lot of the, shall we say, Judeo-Ukrainian oligarchic class, they do come from this area as well. It's a city which rose to prominence very much during the Soviet years. During the Russian Empire, Dnipro, Yekaterinodar, as it was called, wasn't very prominent. I mean, we did hear about it during the Russian Civil War, but even before then, it was never like a major city. So it's very much a Soviet Frankenstein's monster type of creation. And apparently they're saying that this Russian nuclear Zaporozhye power plant is required to power that city, as well as some of the resources surrounding it. So I think in future discussions, Conrad, between the Russians and the Americans, when they do talk about a peace treaty, we'll see the nuclear Zaporozhye power plant as one of the main sort of bargaining chips that the Russians currently have in their hands. But again, the Americans will probably be making very heavy demands for it. And so it'll be interesting exactly how Putin organizes himself, because recently he has shown himself to be a bit more sovereign in his statements, which is he's been a bit more defensive. He's been openly stating that the Russians are succeeding, and even the Ukrainians are showing a lot of weakness. I don't know if you saw, Conrad, the recent television ad that they showed across Ukraine, where instead of showing Ukrainian soldiers victorious, the military ads in Ukraine are now presenting the Ukrainian soldiers as the victims. As they're showing, obviously it's highly propagandized and highly PR'd, but the clips are showing Russian soldiers sort of victoriously waltzing into Ukrainian villages, abusing the civilians and abusing the Ukrainian soldiers. So they're kind of almost victimizing themselves now. The triumphant view that Ukraine is winning and killing millions of Russians, that kind of position is kind of left. It's now that the Ukrainians are these poor victimized people, the new butcher massacre discourse, I think, is back in the picture. And so I think the Ukrainians very much are really dependent on this virtue signaling, moral grandstanding for the world, for the world to continue to fund, and I say the world in a globalist sense, to continue to fund their particular operation. But the only unfortunate thing for Ukraine, and all the oppositionary members to Zelensky have already admitted it, that there are strings attached. It's very clear now, and even the anonymized interviews from the Ukrainian politicians have admitted that all of the freebies, all of the free money that was given to Ukraine had strings attached to it. These were essentially, this money was given as credit. The Ukrainians will need to pay it back with interest. And now the model, and now essentially what we see is that you have a Jewish president of Ukraine who has made a deal with an international country, such as America and the NATO states, has taken out a huge loan. And now the Ukrainian government will need to repay that loan for literally tens of decades, centuries into the future. And in fact, it may never be able to repay that loan, especially with growing interest rates. So a Jewish president has made a usurious deal representing a majority of Slavic people. This is almost caricaturishly anti-Semitic in and of itself. But this is the reality that Ukraine is for. And the Ukrainian politician, last thing I'll say is that he made the really hilarious comparison. He said, so we owe the Americans all this money. It's almost as if we lost the war against America and now we have to pay Americans reparations. Were we at war with Russia or America? And it's somewhat true. Like, in fact, Ukraine probably owes more money to America than it does to Russia, which I think speaks volumes about the kind of deals that you can make with the globalists and what kind of soul-selling consequences there will be coming out from them.
Yeah, the situation with negotiations and the potential for European troops, it continues to ramble along. There was a big summit in Paris, this Ukraine summit, as it were, where peacekeepers and whatnot were openly discussed. It's from anti-war. French President Emmanuel Macron hosted about 30 leaders in Paris on Thursday to discuss plans for Ukraine and acknowledged that not all European countries want to send troops to the country as part of a potential future peace deal. Rumor is that Meloni is on the outs with Keir Starmer and Macron, that she's not as into this coalition of the willing thing as they are. It's not unanimous, Macron said, while insisting that some European countries will send a reassurance force to Ukraine despite Russia's strong objections to any sort of deployment of Western troops and the lack of U.S. support for the idea. Macron said the deployment he envisions would not act as peacekeeping forces or replace Ukrainian troops on the front lines. He said the purpose would be to send troops to strategic towns and bases and to act as a deterrent against potential Russian aggression. A day earlier, Macron said any European troops deployed in Ukraine would respond to any potential Russian attacks, a scenario that could risk a direct NATO-Russia war and nuclear escalation. The meeting Macron hosted on Thursday was the third summit of what he and British Prime Minister Keir Starmer are calling the Coalition of the Willing, echoing the term used for the countries that backed the U.S. invasion of Iraq in 2003. The summits began in response to the Trump administration's push for peace in Ukraine and steps to limit military aid, although U.S. weapon shipments have resumed after a brief pause. While Macron and Starmer are pushing for a European-led initiative for Ukraine, the UK has acknowledged that a troop deployment to Ukraine won't happen without US support, which, everybody knows that's true. And this comes, of course, as Zelensky has announced that the US mineral deal continues to stall and isn't happening because apparently the US keeps, quote unquote, changing the demands. Obviously, Zelensky also at this Paris summit talked about how he's petitioning the U.S. to build Patriot defense systems in Ukraine, to build European defense systems within Ukraine, to get all of these Gibbs, potentially being produced in Western Ukraine so that they can keep, defending themselves. But he also said, nobody will give our land to the Russians because the U.S. and Russia are still, meeting without the Ukrainians' president. In upcoming negotiations in the United States, he even said that Zelensky himself, Ukrainian delegation won't go, that he will basically trust Macron and Starmer, the UK and France, to negotiate on his behalf. So Zelensky is really all in with the Europeans at this point. And again, the ongoing negotiations with the Russians, they don't really seem to be going the way Trump would like, because the Russians have published multiple statements now that they don't really see the point in any kind of ceasefire negotiations. Russia is winning militarily, but again, they've already expressed that any kind of ceasefire would also allow the Ukrainians to regroup. But at this point, it would also, as we know, of course, it would present the opportunity for a much more Pyrrhic victory that could lead to domestic unrest at home if people are frustrated that tens of thousands of Russians died just to get some of these paltry land gains. But The most likely truce, now that the energy truce has totally failed because the Ukrainians immediately targeted Russian energy and the Russians, of course, struck back. The new discussion is for this Black Sea truce. And this is from Kyle Anzalone. Russia says negotiations with U.S. on Black Sea truce still ongoing. The Kremlin says the Russian and U.S. officials are meeting to discuss a new agreement to implement the limited Black Sea ceasefire. Moscow has said some sanctions relief is key to the success of the deal. According to the Russian state outlet TASS, Moscow and Washington are discussing the terms of a new agreement to relaunch the Black Sea Initiative. Russia and the United States are considering a new agreement whose framework is currently being discussed, Foreign Ministry spokeswoman Maria Zakharova said Thursday. The Black Sea Initiative was first implemented in July 2022 to allow for commercial shipping through the war zone. After a year, Moscow withdrew from the agreement, saying Western sanctions were preventing Russian exports. The U.S. brokered deal was announced on Tuesday and will allow commercial shipping to resume in the Black Sea, as well as Ukraine and Russia halting attacks on energy infrastructure. After the deal was announced, TASS quoted a Russian official saying the lifting of restrictions on port servicing of ships and sanctions on ships under the Russian flag engaged in food, including fish and fertilizer trade, was a condition for resumption of the Black Sea Initiative. Ukrainian President Zelensky rejected the idea of removing some Russian ships and companies from Western blacklists. The idea of a ceasefire in the Black Sea. Russia is trying to impose its conditions on our partners, but these conditions are unrealistic. Lifting sanctions from Russia would now be a disaster for diplomacy, he said at a meeting of European leaders. I think Zelensky is afraid about the whole Black Sea situation as well, because he also, in his address to Paris and all these European leaders, he said that Russia is planning an imminent offensive towards Nikolaev and Odessa to connect to Transnistria, which, frankly, I hope is true, but the fact that it's coming from Zelensky almost makes me skeptical. The article goes on to say, along with Zelensky, President Donald Trump will face opposition from several major NATO members as he tries to implement the truce negotiated by his team. French President Emmanuel Macron said it was much too early to discuss lifting sanctions, adding ultimately sanctions depend solely on Russia's choice of aggression, and therefore their lifting depends solely on Russia's choice to comply with international law. So obviously, Macron has proven himself to be one of the most hot. He really is a new Napoleon in the sense that he's going to be going against Russia, when in reality, especially compared to the UK, Germany, these other places, France had an opportunity to be a much more moderate voice, but that was not what Macron was interested in. But what are your thoughts on this Black Sea situation, Dimitri? Do you think there's a potential for a new offensive towards Nikolaev and Odessa?
Well, here's the thing. If we see Russia really warming up towards the agreement, it would mean that, yes, there are actually proper discussions about a long-term Minsk-free type agreement with the current remaining existing state of Ukraine. Because the point of the agreement is that, of course, grain continues to be shipped out of Ukraine, out of Russia. Neither side interrupts one another. And, of course, they can continue to export these goods. And Turkey, of course, plays this middleman sort of role on the Black Sea. And sort of the status quo continues. And perhaps even the lines of the future oblast will be drawn across somewhere where they fall today. And this is very interesting. Again, this is not something we would want in the long term, but I think we will definitely be seeing the position of Russia on this particular deal, as opposed to if Russia goes for, just like the governors of Zaporozhye and Kherson have already suggested, even the governor of Donetsk, if Russia takes Odessa, Nikolaev, etc., all these major port cities, connects Russia to Transnistria, protects it from Moldova and NATO aggression, this would be absolutely the optimal way for long-term peaceful stability, and it will prevent any sort of Ukrainian regime terrorism on the shorelines, because at the moment the Russian Black Fleet is not doing very well. Like, we do know they're stationed somewhere near the alleged Putin's castle, Putin's huge mansion located near Sochi, right? So in Novorossiysk, somewhere there, the Russian Black Fleet is actually just essentially hiding from these drones that the Ukrainians have been throwing at them for the last 2 years, and they're being managed by Nicholas Patrushev, Putin's right-hand man. So as Russia is developing this new anti-naval drone technology, it's very interesting that the Black Sea, they do need it to, they need the Black Sea to be calmed down, because even I've heard Russian commentators, and I'm not even sure how they're legally even allowed to say this, but they said that the Russians have lost the Black Sea battle. The Ukrainians have in fact they've destroyed the Russian flagship all the way, in 2022. They've forced the Russian Black Sea into a defensive position. The Russians haven't attempted any sort of amphibian type operation in Nikolaev or Odessa. Kherson has fallen. And so, in fact, this is one of the fronts which Russia has lost since the beginning. And it would benefit Russia to have a certain peaceful trade negotiation with Ukraine in terms of its exports going forward, at least until, again, Ukraine is subdued and pacified through some sort of further military action on the land. So I think either way, we'll definitely be looking at how Russia reacts to this entire Ukraine peace deal discussion before, of course, the grain deal sort of kicks in. But One of the really interesting things is Zelensky officially has called out Putin for being a very old man. He said, look, he's 72, his death is inevitable, right? So, I mean, beyond the sort of assassination talks that we know the SBU conducts on a regular basis, and of course they assassinate many Russians, terrorist acts, etc., across Russia are commonplace now. Zelensky has also stated that Putin really doesn't have a successor. He sort of alluded to this, and then he said that, well, maybe the next president of Russia after Putin, perhaps he won't be as hawkish, and maybe the SMO simply will end as it started, really suddenly, without any sort of pretext, without any sort of operational consideration. And I think that's a real threat. As you said, we spoke many times about the fact that the United Russia doesn't seem to be moving out any sort of political alternative to Putin in the long term. But this is a discussion for another day. The interesting thing is Putin's response to this, very personal proclamation by Zelensky was that, again, he called Zelensky Hitler, or was like essentially compared him to Hitler, but also he stated that the entire Ukrainian government is illegitimate, not just the president because of his lack of election last year in May 2024, but the entirety of the Ukrainian government, including the Rada, all these bureaucratic electoral positions, perhaps even the Ukrainian Supreme Court, the Ukrainian court officials, judges are also illegitimate. So this is a big escalation in talking points. This means that just like in 2022, there was one of the speeches that Putin gave. He said that, look, we can have discussions with the military, the Ukrainian generals and the commanders to actually talk this through, to talk through a surrender. It's almost like Putin is now addressing the Ukrainian military. Maybe Syrskyi, maybe he's addressing other Ukrainian generals and stating, look, if you guys want a peace deal, you need to overthrow your own government because they're illegitimate in our eyes, and we'll be able to work with the military directly. And that's quite an interesting consideration if you think about it, Conrad, because remember the Serbian-NATO-Bosnian war that happened in the 1990s? That's exactly what the Serbian military and the Serbian generals were the ones that signed those agreements with the Bosniaks and the NATO officials. It wasn't the Serbian politicians. And so Putin, knowing his, Balkan history, probably alludes to that fact that, look, the Ukrainian politicians are garbage, but we will work with the Ukrainian generals to bring around this peaceful solution. Not sure how legitimate or long-standing this particular arrangement would be, but I think this entire sort of crap flinging across the border, you're Hitler, and then someone like Kanye West comes out and says, I'm Hitler, with a blinged out swastika on his neck. I think it's somewhat comical. Like, we need to move past the World War II style rhetoric because, frankly, the new enemy is not the Third Reich. It's clearly Chabad Lubavitch who runs this entire debacle from abroad. So I think it's quite clear. And look, frankly, let's just speak very metaphysically here, Conrad. Belgorod, right? The area that Ukraine is invading at the moment, they're trying to take a few villages. They haven't pushed in. They haven't progressed very much since last week. We can say maybe a few hundred meters at most. They're still fighting the villages which are on the border of Belgorod. It's literally in Russian territory, but they haven't progressed to the city of Belgorod itself. And frankly, it does appear to be a part of the Kursk operation because it's taking place where Kursk meets Belgorod, essentially, where the two are in close proximity and adjacent. So we can kind of say maybe this is just the Ukrainian plan to support their expedition into Kursk. What's interesting is Belgorod, just outside of the city itself, there's a really famous statue to Sviatoslav built by Vyacheslav Klikov in the 1990s. As you remember, Sviatoslav the Brave, the Russian Alexander the Great who defeated Khazaria, the famous statue is located literally in Belgorod region, just standing outside of the city. It's almost like a sign of Russian dominance over the Khazarians. And famously, the shield of the fallen Khazarian warrior under whose hooves he lies, the shield used to have a Star of David on the original model until the local Russian politicians said, look, we're not going to have a Khazarian fallen soldier with a Star of David on his shield lying around in the Belgorod region. That's too anti-Semitic. So Vyacheslav Klikov edited the star in the shield to be an 8-pointed star as opposed to a 6-pointed Star of Renfam, which is, I think, very symbolic. And hopefully that particular statue, if you see the Ukrainians, for example, shoot it, take that statue down, I think it'll be a big sign that we know who runs this particular regime. We know what offends them. And it's quite curious. But generally, geographically, Belgorod is a very flat, plain area. There are some forests, but there are almost no hills. So there are some iron ore mines that go back hundreds of years. This is where Russians gathered and created some of their steel for their armor and weapons back in the days of Ivan Grozny, Ivan III, etc., even Kievan Rus days, like ancient times. But besides that, Belgorod is a very flat ground. So if the Russian defenses give out, we may see very swift and quick progression by the Ukrainians, God forbid, throughout the Belgorod region. So I'm hoping the Russian defenses are very much on point. And I think they are because we notice Russians are kind of halted their progression somewhat across the other frontiers, and they're very much trying to hold out some of their native areas in Belgorod, Kursk, Bryansk, which again, these are areas with the highest Russian birth rates. These are the most great Russian ethnically heavy areas. Like there are almost no minorities living there, besides a few groups of gypsies, right? It's a very wholesome Russian region. And so the Russians symbolically defending those regions, I think, will go very far in terms of showing that they actually care about their native population. They're not willing to give them up to a bunch of NATO mercenaries and these Ukro-Banderite marauders.
Yeah, of course, Russia needs to really wrap up the Kursk situation as soon as possible, and they need to expand the zone of operations in Sumy and Kharkov. Of course, they have been slowly but surely doing that, but for a while, people thought that because they've been focusing on that was going to be the focus as opposed to Odessa, Nikolaev. But again, we've been talking about on the show for years now that the way to get the least territory with the most benefit would be to get Odessa, Nikolaev. Those would probably be the two most beneficial oblasts to obtain. And then, of course, Kursk, Sumy, Chernigov, mostly for the purposes of being a buffer zone from the places that have already been so destroyed by the war in the past 8-10 years. So obviously we have to keep praying for peace. And of course, the church situation continues to be an issue there. We're going to talk about some church news in a second. But as we start to wrap up, we have to cover the situation in Africa. Big news, of course, as the Sudanese armed forces, the junta there, have pretty much retaken all of Khartoum, the capital city metropolis area of Sudan. They have pushed the rapid support forces supported by the United Arab Emirates east of the White Nile River, which is the big sort of barrier between these two areas. And this is from Al Jazeera. The Sudanese army hopes big wins in the capital can signal a turning point in the civil war with the paramilitary RSF. Sudan's army has scored some major victories in the capital, Khartoum, against the rapid support forces as the war between them nears the 2-year mark. But the fighting between the Sudanese armed forces and its paramilitary rival, which has devastated the country, appears far from over. There are fears now that the country's territorial integrity could be jeopardized as the warring parties, each of whom has their own backers, look to entrench themselves in captured territories. Now, the Sudanese army and its supporters are celebrating 2 big wins this month. On Wednesday, Army Chief Abdel Fattah al-Burhan declared that the capital, Khartoum, is free after his forces recaptured the airport from the RSF, taking full control of the city and forcing paramilitary troops to flee southward. The RSF had taken the airport at the onset of the war in April 2023, giving it a tactical and psychological edge. The airport victory for the SAF came less than a week after its soldiers managed to recapture the presidential palace in Khartoum, a major symbolic victory in the counteroffensive the SAF launched against the RSF in September. Al-Burhan, the country's de facto leader, announced the full takeover of Khartoum from the presidential palace as he set foot in it for the first time in 2 years. And the other big news on this front comes from the retreating RSF forces. The UAE is apparently enraged at this and have even made contacts apparently with Wagner forces in the neighboring Central African Republic to begin supplying the RSF with supplies to potentially regroup and launch a counteroffensive. And again, I don't know why the Russians want to be allied with the Emiratis. The Emiratis are the biggest Shabbos goys in the Middle East. They've since then long surpassed the Saudis. And even in this issue specifically, the Saudis are less embarrassing. The Saudis have pledged support to the SAF and to the rebuilding of Sudan. So it appears that they're not 100% aligned with the rapid support forces. But the UAE, again, with these Wagner connections, I don't know exactly how much Russia has to do with it, but it appears that perhaps the Central African Republic is going to get dragged into this. And that leads us to potentially connecting to the DRC war, because CAR is just north of the Democratic Republic of the Congo. But we do have some updates from the AP regarding the Congo situation. Rebels agreed to a ceasefire with African coalition troops departing from eastern Congo. The M23 rebels in control of key areas of eastern Congo agree Friday to a ceasefire with African coalition peacekeepers who have announced their withdrawal even as the conflict between the insurgents and Congo's government continues. The rebels and troops from the South African Development Community, or SADC, said in a joint news release that they would work together to rebuild the airport in the eastern hub of Goma, which was damaged when rebels took over, so that the SADC troops could depart the country in an orderly way. The force of several thousand peacekeeping troops from South Africa, Malawi, and Tanzania had been sent to eastern Congo by the SADC in 2023 to help the Congolese government pacify a mineral-rich region plagued by insurgencies. The troops failed to stop the lightning assault started in January by the Rwanda-backed M23 rebels that have claimed several key cities and that left several peacekeepers dead, eroding support for the mission in the donor countries. So obviously, M23 is, even though they've been condemned internationally, they seem to somewhat have the upper hand. And this is from Reuters. Qatar hosts talks between Congo and Rwanda, also meets with rebels, sources say. Qatari mediators hosted a second round of talks on Friday between DRC and Rwanda and separately met representatives of the Rwandan-backed rebellion waging an insurgency in eastern Congo. Congo President Felix Tshisekedi and his Rwandan counterpart Paul Kagame met last week in Doha for the first talks since M23 rebels stepped up an offensive there in January. The talks between Tshisekedi and Kagame and their subsequent call for a ceasefire provided a glimmer of hope in de-escalation of eastern Congo's biggest conflict in decades. But M23 dismissed those calls, saying peace would only be achieved through direct talks with Kinshasa, and continued its offensive with the capture of a strategic town. M23 representatives met Qatari mediators in Doha on Friday and did not hold talks with the Congolese or Rwandan officials also in town, said the sources, 2 from the Congolese government and 2 from the rebels. The content of the discussions was not clear. Qatar's foreign ministry did not immediately respond to a request for comment. Congo, the United Nations, and Western governments say Rwanda is supporting the rebels by sending troops and arms. Kigali has denied helping M23, saying its forces are acting in self-defense against Congo's army and ethnic Hutu militiamen linked to the 1994 Rwandan genocide that killed around 1 million people, mostly ethnic Tutsis. The conflict has raised fear of a wider regional war, with the armies of Congo, Rwanda, and Burundi having all participated in the fighting. Farther north, Uganda also has thousands of troops in eastern Congo. They are helping Kinshasa fight another militia, but are viewed with suspicion by many Congolese given Uganda's intervention in past wars against Congo's government and accusations by UN experts last year that Kampala was providing support to M23. Uganda denied the UN experts' allegations. In a sign of possible diplomatic strains, a Congolese general on Friday expressed indignation about social media comments by the head of Uganda's People Defense Forces last weekend that threatened to seize a city in northern Congo. UPDF will not oppose M23's seizure of Kisangani, but they better move quickly, otherwise we will do it ourselves, Muhoozi Kainerugaba, who is President Yoweri Museveni's son and regularly makes inflammatory social media posts, had written. General Jacques Ichelagonza, who is in charge of operations and intelligence for Congo's military, was asked by reporters about Kainerugaba's comments after a meeting with Ugandan counterpart. If it is true that this Ugandan military leader's chief's account, we have expressed our indignation. We told them that we are not happy about all of that. So obviously Uganda generally seems to side with Rwanda and M23 here. There have now been rumors apparently that Burundi was about to be invaded by Rwanda. They were talking all about this. Mm-hmm. So Central and Eastern Africa is really quite the war zone these days. And again, I don't know if there's a possibility of these two fronts merging, if they somehow realized that some of them were on similar backers and had same sides, but it does seem that we are looking at the third African World War might be arriving before the broader Third World War, despite the fact that the First and Second African World Wars only occurred in the past 40 years. So, Africa has never been a bastion of stability, but all the situations there have escalated. Of course, in South Africa, Marco Rubio condemned the kill the Boer chants from the EFF, but the South African Supreme Court, or Court of Human Rights or whatever it is, basically said that the chant is fine and it's some cultural symbol and has nothing to do with the ongoing white genocide there. So that's the African updates for you. I don't know if you want to perhaps enlighten us on what's going on with our friend Milorad Dodik, Dimitri, who has recently had an international arrest warrant issued for him. But there's also this huge earthquake in Myanmar and Thailand. So a few issues before we discuss church news.
No, absolutely. So Milorad Dodik has been issued with an international warrant. Of course, the Bosnian courts are trying to get this guy arrested because they really see the future Serbian separatism in Bosnia and Herzegovina to actually be a reality. Of course, Dodik has met up with figures such as Vucic in the past. He's literally traveled to Russia, traveled to Belarus, met up with Lukashenko, traveled to Hungary, met up with the prime minister there. He's a big Trump-like figure, and I think even for the Serbs, he almost appears like he's literally better than Vucic in some ways. In fact, if he, in the future, runs for the presidency of Serbia and vows to sort of unite the two countries, on the basis of, being both the leader of Republika Srpska and the president of Serbia, that would be an unprecedented move, but I think it would be definitely possible. Unfortunately, though, the Serbian politics, it's very much like in other countries, Conrad, it's very based around like a strong party system. You actually need some sort of party presence or else the local oligarchs, etc., simply won't support you. But the point of an international warrant here is that the Bosnian courts essentially are relying on the fact that the Hungarian troops on the ground and the other troops supporting Dodik in Republika Srpska, that small region in Bosnia and Herzegovina, will, of course, oblige according to the warrant. And maybe if Dodik is within their vicinity, they will, of course, arrest him and bring him to those courts so he can make his appearance. Again, he's been sentenced to a year in jail at least, and he should be apparently abstaining from politics. When we talk about church news in Ukraine, we'll see very similar church warrants and arrests happening over there as well in regards to church leaders by the courts. But in Dodik's case, I think this is very much a political persecution, which hopefully he won't bend and sort of break to the will and sort of ask for some sort of clemency from the Bosnian government. I think like in the case of Georgescu, Conrad, it's shown that you really cannot make any deals with any sort of political or judicial structure which is run by the globalists, especially in the European context. They will not show any mercy. They will demonize you. And most likely, if you give up your supporters on the ground, they will lose faith in you. And in fact, you may never have that support base ever again, because they'll say, well, you're a weak leader. You're not standing up for our Serbian ideals, for our people. And so I think Dodik's only play here at the moment is just simply to resist, simply avoid arrest, and just have his militias as well as those Hungarian guards that he has, which very reminiscent of the Latvian rifleman that Lenin had protecting him in a weird sort of historical analogy. Dodik really needs to just stay away from the courts and stay away from any of those Bosnian officials. And I think Vucic also has a green light of sorts. Like if he really wants to act as the sovereign president of Serbia, he will need to act. If, of course, the Bosnians bring in the army or bring in some sort of special forces in order to arrest Dodik, Vucic, I think, could potentially escalate things. And maybe the Serbian military could, of course, enter into Republika Srpska and begin supporting them there. So I think the case is very much open in terms of what can take place in Bosnia-Herzegovina. But at the moment, I think Dodik is one of the most, despite the fact that he loves Israel to some extent, right? He does have those philo-Semitic tendencies. I think generally speaking, he's one of the best leaders that Eastern Europe has today, similar to Lukashenko or Georgescu, who unfortunately we don't see in power at the moment. But, what's happening in East Asia, just as tragic. Again, crazy earthquake shakes all of Southeast Asia, Thailand, and Myanmar, of course. This is the peninsula, sort of like the Balkans of Southeast Asia. You can say they almost look like the Balkans as well, geographically speaking, but the entire region has been shaken. A lot of the buildings there are not resistant to earthquakes, unlike Japan and Turkey, which, remember the Turkish earthquake, which Erdogan was blamed for? A lot of those buildings apparently were supposed to be earthquake resistant, and unfortunately that technology simply wasn't there. So you had the depths of thousands. In Japan, famously, where they're actually well known for having earthquakes, the Japanese architects, they do construct buildings in a very particular way. But we do see apartments falling over. You do see all kinds of debris everywhere. It's a country already torn by civil war. Most likely there won't be first responders in the same capacity as we saw in sort of in the North Syria, Turkish region, which a lot of those Middle Eastern countries showed a lot of solidarity. Sort of Muslims united, and they sort of set aside their arms, fighting amongst each other in order to assist the victims there. But Myanmar is a little bit different. The junta there, the various rebel groups, I think the reaction to this earthquake will be a bit slower, and most likely this will lead to the deaths of tens of people. So very unfortunate. And apparently the earthquake was even felt in China. So quite a huge. Mother Nature itself, sort of esoterically speaking, is lashing out against the bloodshed that's happening on this earth. And I think that's one of the reactions. Generally when we do read about the prophecies and clairvoyant sayings of saints, they do speak about natural disasters being quite common during the end times. And I think this is one of those hallmarks. And not to speak about it too superstitiously, but if we read about the Christians of the first few centuries, the 5th, 6th century, whenever a massive plague, earthquake, not a solar eclipse, but like a tsunami would take place, a lot of Christians saw this as a sign of God punishing and trying to sober them up from their state of sin that they're in at the moment. And I think this is probably the correct way to view natural disasters, especially in places like Thailand and Myanmar. And I won't speak about Myanmar too much, but Thailand is well known for its debauchery and all kinds of degeneracy that takes place there. So I think a lot can be said about that particular part of the world and what kind of punishment it deserves in the sort of considering the spiritual state of affairs over there.
Now, Thailand, they've also been a big victim of, U.S. soft power attempting to cleave them away from China, and Myanmar, of course, struggling with the junta to win its civil war. So this could easily lead to another downfall of some of these more multipolar aligned states as they struggle with this, with this earthquake. But you talked about Dodik, of course. Dodik, I think, in anticipation of this was part of why he attended the anti-Semitism conference in Israel that he was attending. But this comes from GIW, the president of the Republika Srpska, Milorad Dodik, who was in Israel to take part in a conference against anti-Semitism, was asked to leave the conference as soon as the organizers were informed that the warrant had been issued. So, obviously, I don't think Jews are super loyal to Serbs, even if Dodik has an interest in being loyal to Jews. But obviously, the notices of an Interpol red notice, like you mentioned, is going to be issued for this. And, who would abide by it? What would happen there? Obviously, Israel isn't necessarily going to arrest him on that, because that would also mean that they would, in theory, be supporting these sort of international organizations that obviously want to arrest Netanyahu whenever he travels abroad. So that's the situation there. But with the earthquake, yeah, some of these crazy footage of water from rooftop pools falling down, crushing people to death. I wouldn't be surprised if, by the end of this weekend, the death toll was well into the thousands. So we have to keep prayers for Myanmar, Thailand, and China. But I had also briefly mentioned the whole UAE Saudi Arabia thing. Saudi Arabia, just while we were recording this, they have announced that they're inviting the head of the Syrian armed forces, their kind of political wing, inviting them to Riyadh, to Saudi Arabia, to discuss rebuilding Sudan. So clearly Saudi and UAE are on opposite sides of this. Obviously, I think there was UAE-backed militias in Syria that also failed to come to power and enter into the HTS-SNA sort of coalition. And I wouldn't be surprised if the Houthi situation escalates, that Saudi Arabia tries to box out the Southern Transitional Council and only allow their proxy group there to rise up. So Saudi Arabia has been taking a lot more victories than the UAE, despite the fact that the UAE has prostrated itself towards Israel even harder than the Saudis. So the Emiratis just don't seem to know how to play the game as well as they could. But I think we do have to talk about some of this church news as well, Dimitri. I don't know if you've seen this commission inspecting the relics at the Kiev Caves Lavra and everything that's going on there.
Yeah, of course, that's probably the most egregious news story of the week. Unfortunately, the commission of the Ministry of Culture of Ukraine has arrived to the lower caves of the Kiev-Pечерsk Lavra, which they've taken control of since March, April 2023. But of course, they delayed actually inspecting the relics. But yes, they've broken all of the locks. They've unlocked all of the sarcophagi, all of the coffins of the saints located within the caves. They've, of course, the police did this with big lock-breaking mechanisms, etc., like wrenches, etc. So the point of the commission is to inspect all the relics, to take down all the details, exactly how many bones are located. They've even brought over, and this is incredibly sacrilegious, it's not even comfortable for me to mention this, but they even brought around a veterinary officer, so a vet, in order to check if any of the bones in the Kiev-Pечерsk caves belonging to the saints are in fact of animals. So, yeah, this is, of course, incredibly blasphemous, but this is what the modern Ukrainian state is about. So that even to disrespect the Orthodox Church there, this is the holiest place in Kiev, and yet they conduct these sort of PR acts in order to weaken the faith of the local people. Like, hey, maybe some of the relics are fake. Maybe they belong to animals, cats, dogs, pigs, whatever. It's just another strike on the board of Ukrainian sacrilege over the past few years, and I would even say decades, frankly, since the Russian Civil War, we've seen things like this take place. It's very unfortunate. So this commission has until the 30th of May of 2025, so until this year, basically until the beginning of the persecution in June of this year, to inspect all the relics, catalog everything, and write reports about what exactly is being held in the Lavra, what kind of icons, what kind of ancient vestments, decorations, etc., including the bones and the relics of the saints themselves. Some of the relics are incorrupt. Some are, of course, some of the relics of saints are in the state of bones, as we saw of the saints of the earliest centuries. In fact, the incorruptibility of relics in the Orthodox Church, there's quite a big spectrum on exactly how the relics of the saints are presented, but the Kiev-Pечерsk Lavra has a variety of them. So that's one of the most interesting things. We're talking about tens of saints, by the way, up to, I believe, in the low 80s, and all of this will be sacrilegiously catalogued, and essentially it's like a Talmudic census of sorts. You can imagine the Antichrist doing the same thing in Palestine and Israel when his reign begins. What will happen to the holy places there? We try not to think about these sort of things. What's interesting is the sacrilege again continues. The Russians freed a lot, most of the Kurskaya Oblast, and now going through some of the parishes and churches. This is other footage most of you may have seen. We posted some of it on Telegram, and it's been seen on X. A lot of the churches that were occupied by Ukrainian forces and even international mercenaries, many of whom do not belong to the Christian faith, we need to keep in mind. So who knows what kind of dark gods they worshipped and venerated. We knew for sure they had Israeli troops, actually, former IDF and all kinds of Jewish mercenaries fighting for the Ukrainian side. A lot of these churches were desecrated. There's graffiti on the inside of the churches. A lot of the parishes in the Kurskaya Oblast were used as storage facilities, as just people as toilets. The actual altar table in one of the parishes, as described by Archpriest Dmitry Vasilenko, this is the chief archpriest of the entire Russian military. So under the bishop, he's the one who actually trains other military priests. He traveled to the Kurskaya Oblast himself, and he helped sort of identify a lot of these churches and clean them up, but he openly had a really based interview. And why I say it's based, because right next to him sits the famous Donbass doctor, Yuri Yevich, who we mentioned previously. This is Strelkov's left-hand man, essentially, next to Pavel Gubarev, one of the most based and patriotic Russians today. He has a huge YouTube channel. Of course, he's one of the best medical trainers available for the military. He provides YouTube videos for Russians, teaching them, if you're on the front lines, this is how you, for example, patch someone up. This is how you provide first aid. He's a great sort of trainer, but he's very Orthodox Christian as well. And in fact, he's been documenting some of his battles in the Volchansk area of the Kharkovskaya Oblast and in the Kurskaya Oblast. He's an exceptional person. You'd want someone like that to be the Minister of Defense, frankly, in the near future, hopefully. Not, figures such as Shoigu, who fortunately, and we thank God, has left the Ministry of Defense, has been somewhat delegated to a secretarial role in the Russian government now. But Yuri Yevich sitting there with Archpriest Dmitry Vasilenkov, they're discussing the sacrilege in the church. The altar tables themselves were used as diners, essentially, which, speaks volumes, especially about a lot of these liberals and a lot of these pro-Ukrainians, especially those, unfortunately, coming out of Goarch and some of these other places. Not to say that Greek people condone any of this behavior, but we have seen, Conrad, people post that, well, the Ukrainians are Orthodox Christians too. What kind of an Orthodox Christian would desecrate an Orthodox church, even if it belongs to a country against whom you're fighting? I mean, this is just something completely unspeakable. I'm pretty sure even the Third Reich didn't commit things like, we know the Third Reich opened over 10,000 churches on occupied land. This is something completely foreign, and it's deeply Russophobic, deeply anti-Christian. So desecrated churches are being cleaned up, they're being refurbished. It's really sad seeing some of that footage, seeing all the icons being destroyed. The other interesting discourse we saw on Ukrainian television, and it's somewhat admirable that the Ukrainian journalists are actually providing us footage like this. There was a television debate, actually, between a priest of the OCU, the fake church created by Patriarch Bartholomew and Mike Pompeo, and a priest of the canonical church in this town of Bukovina. And the two priests had a debate online, literally just like an old school sort of televised debate. And the Orthodox Christian priest essentially stated that, look, we have all this footage of these churches being taken over by Ukrainian Banderites, these neo-Nazis, these radical Ukrainians. What do you say about that footage? And the OCU priest just said openly that all the footage is fake. It's being filmed by Russian filmmakers as propaganda. He just outright denied that any open persecution, the beating up of bishops, the taking of churches, the stealing of anti-minces from the altars is all completely artificial and fake. So I'm just baffled. So we're reaching a level of ignorance here that is, people address American boomers and they say the American boomers are dumb and they're completely uneducated. They believe 9/11, they believe the COVID, they believe the JFK assassination. But it seems like even all over Europe, you have these sort of tendencies. And even this priest, he is sitting there and he's telling us that all the persecution footage that we've seen for the last 3 years has been completely fake, which, again, not really worth commenting this, but this is the level of discourse that we're having here. When you're discussing things with schismatics, they're not going to talk in good faith, even in Ukraine. And that's very unfortunate. But I am somewhat happy, at least, that they did have like a frank and honest conversation on air, which, it's better than simply remaining silent. Moving on to bitter news, we had Metropolitan Theodosius of Cherkasy, who we cover almost on a weekly basis because it seems like he does amazing things every week, right? And this week he actually tonsured 4 nuns into Orthodox monasticism. And he, when you receive a tonsureship as a nun or a monk in the Orthodox Christian Church, you actually receive a new name similar to your baptismal name. And these nuns, Conrad, they were named after the royal martyrs. So nun Alexandra, Olga, Tatiana, Maria, Anastasia. So in fact, it was 5 nuns, my apologies, but they were named after the royal martyrs. And that's incredibly impressive for one reason. You may say, well, it's just, there's many saints, but in Ukraine, in the Ukrainian context, even the canonical church, unfortunately, especially those who are deeply pro-Ukrainian, have been removing icons of Tsar Nicholas II and the new martyrs from some of their churches because they believed the last Tsar, even though he was a victim of the Bolsheviks, they were deeply anti-Ukrainian. So they were removing some of these so-called based Russian saints from their churches, from their molitvoslova, their prayer books. We've seen that tendency, not just with the schismatics, but in some unfortunate dioceses of the canonical church too. So Metropolitan Theodosius showing us that, look, we can actually, as Ukrainian Orthodox Christians, venerate these deeply Russian, so these new martyrs from Russia who ruled and reigned over the Russian Empire. It's a great sign. It's a really big move of solidarity for the Orthodox Christian Russians and Ukrainians. It's a big sign of reunion. And I think one of the most impressive stories, and this, I'm going to just read out this prophecy, which is how we haven't heard of, but this is something completely new. And it mirrors some of the things actually said by previous saints, such as Lawrence of Chernigov and St. Jonah of Odessa. And this was actually given in a 6-minute sermon by Archbishop Pitirim of Skopinsk in Russia. So a very conservative, very deeply Orthodox Christian bishop. But I'll just read out the sermon that he gave, and I think we all should listen to it very intently. So, and I quote, he said, "My spiritual father told me that I would live to see these days when they will burst into every house and slaughter everyone to the last man. They will simply kill everyone, but the ones who will burst in will no longer be Ukrainians. They will belong to other wild hordes and wild tribes. My spiritual father said that we will have to gather in our homes, and in these homes, everything must be arranged separately, everything independently. A well with water, a stove for the heating, a supply of firewood would need to gather supplies, and you must always have a stock of food in your homes." He told me that this at the end of the last century, in 1999 or 1998, and it seems that this time is already approaching. He said that you will gather in communities in these houses, and you must continually read the Psalms in turn, day and night, and so that prayer does not cease. And they say that they will not break into those homes in which the Psalms are being read. The Lord will protect and preserve these homes. For all of those who do not do this, especially those who have engaged in magic, witchcraft, it will be terrible what will happen there. And we see it, the news that reaches us when beasts are unleashed on Ukraine, or what was happening in Syria, even those reports from Syria, these will be closer stories, because it is exactly these people that will come to Rus and Europe. This is what awaits us. It could have been avoided, or the time could have been postponed if our people were more devout, more reasonable. But once again, they turned out to be foolish. Victory, even if it comes in Ukraine, does not mean that we will defeat the real enemy. But we must fight with these worshippers of demons here in our state. And here we are not fighting them, and this is a more dangerous enemy than the one over there. This is what I'm telling you, what my spiritual father said a quarter of a century ago. But at the same time, he said that all those who do as I have said will survive. And then after this great tribulation, through the world's sorrow, victory will come. And then a small time will come, and the small time will be very joyous for Rus. It will be a short time, about 15 to 20 years, as our spiritual ascetics said, a time of the flourishing of faith, when there will be not a single unbeliever in our country. Everyone will be believers. All the churches will be overflowing, and people from all over the world will come to Russia amazed at what is happening here, and they will accept the Orthodox faith. This is, in fact, the mission of our country. But before we return to this path, we must go through these very, very difficult years. And we need to prepare for this because it is difficult and painful when people are unprepared. They will be wandering everywhere. They will be running. They will suffer greatly. But I thank God to have warned us and warned you. Therefore, let us not despair. Let us pray and hope in God. Amen. So Archbishop Pitirim of Skopinsk, one of the great archbishops of the Russian Church, gave this sermon this week. I believe it was either on Sunday or on Monday. And what a great warning, literally mirroring not just the sayings of the Russian elders, but the Greek elders as well. Very similar stories. And notice his warning, not just about the SMO and what's happening in Ukraine. He says that other hordes, wild tribes, he mentions Syria. This is quite a sobering message, I think, from the Archbishop. And I suppose the last message I just wanted to mention, the news from the week, is that the Estonian persecution seemingly has been postponed. Officially, the court in Estonia has issued their order, and they said that, look, the Estonian Orthodox Church of the Moscow Patriarchate needs to forcefully rename itself to the Estonian Christian Orthodox Church. And once it completes that, and once Metropolitan Eugene of the Estonian Orthodox Church, of course, completes that name change, then officially, there won't be any more pressure on the Estonian Orthodox Christians. And I think there will be a short time of reprieve for the Estonian Orthodox Christians. So we need to just kind of, there's a lot of prayerful people who say, well, thank God, at least the Estonians Estonia is a member of NATO will again pause and put a hold on its persecution of orthodoxy. And I think Metropolitan Eugene of Estonia, Evgeny, will, of course, probably rename the church. I think he'll be absolutely down for that. If you still go to the Estonian Orthodox Church website, I believe the name Moscow Patriarchate is still there, but I think very soon it will change. And frankly, I think this is probably for the best, because at the moment, Russia very much is not in a position to stand up for the Estonian Orthodox Christians, unfortunately, given the current geopolitical outlook.
Yeah, the Estonians, I know there's people in the Estonian government that are kind of foaming at the mouth to try to completely ban the canonical church, but hopefully this naming thing will allow for them to, like you said, get a reprieve. I just have two final stories here before we wrap up. and this is from the U.S. Religious Freedom Commission. They condemned a new law banning the UOC in Ukraine. And this was, obviously released from 2024. The report covers everything that went on in 2024. And the report specifically says, in August, Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky signed into law new legal amendments related to the activities of religious organizations, despite widespread concerns about the amendment's compatibility with international law. The revised legislation allows the government to ban religious organizations in Ukraine affiliated with a foreign religious organization whose management center is located in a country waging war against Ukraine. It also bans the Russian Orthodox Church, which only operates in Russian-occupied Ukraine, and Russian World Ruski Mir ideology. The amendments would likely significantly impact the Ukrainian Orthodox Church, which Ukrainian authorities and society have viewed with suspicion following Russia's 2022 invasion due to the UOC's historical and ecclesiastical ties to the Moscow Patriarchate. Furthermore, the new amendments risk imposing collective punishment on individual or members of religious communities. In December, the UN Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights criticized the amendments, stating that they established disproportionate restrictions on the freedom to manifest one's religion and belief. The U.S. CIRF has urged the Ukrainian government to ensure that enforcement of the amendments comply with international human rights standards. So, somewhat surprisingly correct take from the United States on this. But my final story I wanted to address, and I just wanted to prayer request. Everybody needs to pray for Abbot Seraphim of Holy Cross Monastery in West Virginia. I believe he is recently diagnosed with some very large brain tumors in his head, and he's going to have to undergo some pretty intensive treatment. I know he's back at the monastery right now, but he has been a member of the Holy Cross monastic community for 32 years, and for the past 10 years, he's been serving as the abbot. If you've seen any of the videos from Holy Cross, I'm sure you recognize him. He's made some very good videos in the past, so be sure to keep him in your prayers. He's sort of a paragon of orthodoxy in Appalachia, and Holy Cross Monastery. They're growing and expanding, so be sure to keep them, all monastics, in your prayers, especially, of course, those in Ukraine that are undergoing persecution, even these new ones tantred by Metropolitan Theodosius. So before I give the plugs, Dimitri, I'll give you the last word.
Yeah, no, absolutely. We'll keep the abbot in our prayers. And for all those, of course, listening to the show, we really appreciate your support, especially those subscribers on Substack and everyone actually liking the videos, sharing them. We really appreciate the help. We had a great interview and discussion of Jay Dyer on our recent Aether Hour episode, so I recommend everyone really check it out, share it. I think it's a good deep dive. It's like, in some ways, the boomer, the baby's first red pill. This course about one of the first conspiracy theories in American history, and we go very deep. We discuss basically the Bolsheviks, we tie the Vatican into it, we discuss the Italian mob, some of the Talmudic connections. It's a really interesting discourse. So if you haven't subscribed yet, I deeply recommend. Most likely this is the best episode to subscribe to and really get a good taste of what the Aether Hour episodes are about. The premium articles as well are available for you. In fact, hundreds of hours of content, and we appreciate all the support. We've had a lot of engagement recently on Discord, X, Twitter, and Conrad's live streaming every week now. So there's a lot of things happening. And again, we thank all of our deep supporters and listeners. Thank you, guys.
No, I couldn't have said that any better. It's a really good Aether Hour episode. So go ahead and get behind the paywall, support the show, and hear, an hour 40 plus of us just going at it about conspiracies, the world, Israel, world Jewry, all these sorts of things with our good buddy, Jay Dyer. Of course, I want to thank everybody as well. We are now, I believe, at least ranked 73rd on the entire Substack platform for world politics. We were ranked 33rd for the fastest growing world politics show/publication. So thank you all so much for the support. Obviously, you can find all of our stuff at worldwarnow.co or worldwarnow.substack.com. Both links take you to the same place. So whether you're listening on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, YouTube, or X, Substack is sort of the home base, and obviously to get behind the paywall and support the show, that's where all of that can happen. But if you haven't heard, I am live on the YouTube channel and the World War Now X account now every Tuesday evening at 7:45 Central Standard Time. So be sure to set a reminder for that. Hopefully in the near future, I will also be live on Substack once they get desktop streaming set up and streamlined. So check all of that out. Be sure to send a super chat if you want to ask a question. We're probably also going to have another Q&A thread for paid subscribers as well on the Substack. So get behind the paywall for that. But like I said, subscribe to the YouTube channel World War Now. Follow us on X at World War Now _. Follow me at GnomeRad. I'm getting close to 10,000 followers, so follow me there. Follow Dimitri at WWN Host. Be sure to subscribe to us on Telegram at World War Now Telly. We are always posting on there, 24/7. You can also, of course, find us on the Discord. All of these things are linked below. We are hoping to keep building up the Discord. It's a really great community we have going on over there. But again, support the show, worldwarnow.co. And with all of that, we will see you on the next one. God bless.